Hello, welcome back to the Phantom Diary channel. I'm sure there are many of you listening to my stories to fall asleep. Before we start, write in the comments what country you're listening from. So, let's go. I never meant to spend the night in the swamp, but after my car broke down on the back roads, the nearest help was miles away. That's when I saw it. A small cabin, nestled in the thick trees near the swamp's edge. I knocked on the door, desperate, and a man answered, tall, gaunt, with a wild, unkempt beard. He said nothing at first, just stared, but then he motioned for me to come inside. "I can't leave you out there," he finally said, his voice raspy, almost like a whisper. I stepped inside, grateful for shelter, but the cabin was strange. Dimly lit, the air heavy with the smell of moss and mildew. The only furniture was a rickety old table and a small cot in the corner. He didn't offer me anything but pointed to a chair by the window. The swamp outside was alive with noise, croaking frogs, chirping insects, the occasional splash of something large moving in the water. It was unsettling, how thick and alive. The swamp felt like it was watching me. "You shouldn't stay here long," the man said, staring at me from the other side of the room. "Things don't like visitors." I chuckled nervously, trying to brush off the tension, but he wasn't. Joking. His eyes were wide, wild, and fixed on something I couldn't see. It made my skin crawl. I tried to relax, but the feeling of being trapped in that cabin, so close to the swamp, began to gnaw at me. Hours passed. The man didn't speak much after that, and the sounds from outside grew louder. The frogs' croaks grew distorted, becoming deeper, more resonant. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard a faint scraping sound at the door. I thought it was a raccoon or some other animal, but it was followed by a soft tapping, then a scratching, as if something large were trying to get in. I stood, up, moving cautiously toward the door, but the man didn't react. He just sat there, his eyes wide, focused on the door. "I told you," he whispered. "They're coming." Panic surged through me. The noises outside were louder now, unnerving, but I couldn't see anything from the small window. It sounded like something was circling the cabin, something huge. I backed away slowly, my breath quickening. Suddenly the door slammed. The tapping turned into pounding, and the man's eyes went wide with terror. He stood, shaking his head, violently. "Don't open it! Don't you dare open it!" I didn't understand. My mind raced, but before I could make sense of anything, there was a deep, guttural growl from the swamp. It rattled the walls, shaking the cabin. Something was outside, breathing heavily, and I could feel its presence even through the thick door. I stepped back, heart pounding. The man had stopped speaking, his face frozen in fear as the growling grew louder. It was so close now, so suffocating. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, right on the other side of that door, waiting. The silence was broken by a horrible screech, the sound of claws on wood. Then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The growls faded, and the swamp returned to its eerie quiet. I stood frozen, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but the man didn't move. He just stood there staring at the door as if he'd seen this all before. "Why didn't you leave?" I whispered, still too shaken to think straight. The man's voice was barely audible, almost a murmur. "Because I never could. Not once it found me." I didn't understand. I tried to speak, but before I could, the door creaked open by itself. The night air that flooded in was thick, heavy, and smelled of decay. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and bolted out the door. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I ran through the swamp, ignoring the mud sucking at my boots, the branches scratching at my face. I didn't stop until I reached the road, where a car finally passed by and picked me up. To this day, I don't know what that man was hiding from. But as I looked back at the dark swamp through the window of the car, I saw something move in the trees. Something large, with glowing eyes that seemed to follow me, and I knew that whatever it was, it had been watching me the entire time. It was supposed to be a quick exploration. I had heard the stories about the old hospital on the outskirts of town, the rumors of strange noises and things seen out of the corner of your eye. But it was abandoned, a relic from decades ago, and my friends and I thought it would be an easy adventure. We'd been through old buildings before, so what was one more? The air was already thick with unease as we crossed the broken gates. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty like eyes that hadn't blinked in years. The walls, once white, had turned yellow with time. The doors creaked open with little effort, inviting us in. Inside, the smell hit first, a stale, metallic scent like old blood mixed with rust. The hallway stretched out before us, lined with rooms that had decayed over time. We decided to explore the lower floors first, heading toward the elevators. They weren't working, of course, but the stairwell was just as unsettling. Flickering lights that barely lit the steps ahead, and a deep, unsettling silence that seemed to press against our eardrums. We laughed nervously, trying to push away the sense of dread that crept over us. But then, as we explored deeper into the halls, I started to notice something odd. There were fresh footprints in the dust, small, faded prints, as if someone had been here recently, walking through the crumbling hospital with no regard for the place's desolation. Who would be here? I muttered, trying to shake off the thought. But I couldn't. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. We continued down the hallway, our footsteps echoing off the cracked tiles. At the end of the corridor was a door, locked but not tightly. The rusted handle gave way easily with a soft creak, and we stepped inside. The room was cold, too cold for the rest of the building. It looked like it used to be an office, a desk, a chair, and a metal filing cabinet still standing against the wall. But there was something strange about it. The air was dense and the temperature dropped even more as we stepped further in. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, thinking it was a message from one of my friends, but the screen was black. I tapped the screen, then shook the phone, trying to get it to work. Still nothing. Then, something strange happened. The phone screen flickered, and the words, "Look behind you," appeared in bold letters. I turned around instinctively, heart racing, but the room was empty. "Did anyone send this?" I asked, my voice shaking, but my friends only stared at me, pale-faced and silent. Before I could ask again, the air grew colder still. My breath came out in visible clouds, even though the rest of the building was warm. And then I heard it. A soft rustling noise, like paper being shuffled. It came from the corner of the room. I stepped back, but the noise grew louder, more frantic, like something was moving toward us. Slowly, a shape emerged from the shadows. It was tall and thin, its limbs twisting unnaturally. I tried to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. The figure was dressed in an old hospital gown, stained and torn, and its face was covered. Nothing but a smooth, featureless mask. It moved toward us with terrifying speed, its limbs contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Panic exploded in my chest as we turned to run. The door slammed shut in front of us, trapping us inside. The figure was right behind us now, just inches away, its breath cold and heavy on the back of my neck. I scrambled to get the door open, my fingers trembling as I twisted the handle. The others were equally frantic, trying to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The figure's shadow loomed over us, growing taller, its hands stretching toward us with an unnatural hunger. With one last desperate push, the door finally gave way, and we bolted into the hallway. I didn't look back as we ran through the dark corridors, the sound of the figure's distorted footsteps following behind us like a nightmare. When we finally made it outside, gasping for breath, the sun had set completely. The hospital stood, behind us, silent once again. The doors had slammed shut behind us, and the lights inside were all off, as if the building had never been disturbed. None of us spoke as we drove away, the image of the figure haunting each of us. To this day, I still hear its breath cold and heavy whenever I close my eyes. I'd heard whispers about the carnival that set up every summer on the outskirts of town. People spoke of it in hushed tones, some with excitement, others with fear. No one ever stayed long, but the place was always packed at first. They said it had everything: Ferris wheels, games, music, lights, just like any other carnival. But there was something else, something darker, that lingered beneath it all. One night, driven by curiosity, I decided to check it out. The night air was thick with the smell of popcorn and sugar, and the carnival lights shone bright against the dark sky. The sound of laughter and carnival music filled the air, drawing me in despite the odd sense of unease gnawing at my stomach. I walked through the entrance and was immediately struck by how empty it felt. The crowds seemed sparse compared to the noise. People milled about, but none of them spoke to each other. They just stared at the rides, their faces blank as if something had drained all life from them. I pushed the thought aside, chalking it up to the strangeness of the night. I wandered past the booths, games with cheap prizes, clowns who didn't smile, and performers who acted like they were stuck in a loop. But it wasn't until I came to the House of Mirrors that I felt something truly off. It was an old structure, its glass panels cracked and smeared with years of grime. Despite the reflections warping my image, I couldn't help but feel drawn to it. Inside, the air grew heavy, colder. The mirrors seemed to twist, distort. As I walked deeper, the reflections began to change, flickering. My face, my own face, wasn't quite right. It looked older, tired, and angry. I spun around, heart racing. The room behind me was still, but the reflections didn't match the real world. They moved, they watched me. I backed out of the house, breath catching in my throat. I needed to leave, but as I turned toward the exit, I saw a figure standing in the shadows near the Ferris wheel. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a faded carnival worker's uniform. His eyes locked onto mine, piercing and cold. Looking for something? His voice was smooth, like syrup, and his smile, though slight, sent a jolt of terror through me. Before I could respond, the Ferris wheel behind him creaked to life. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows across the field. The man's grin widened. "We've all been waiting for you." Confused, I tried to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. My eyes were locked on the Ferris wheel as it spun faster, faster. Then one of the cars stopped at the top, and a figure in the seat turned toward me. It was a woman. Her face blank, expressionless, but her eyes, they weren't hers. They were mine. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The carnival noises swelled, the music becoming a discordant, maddening shriek. People around me began to turn, slowly, their heads jerking in unison toward me. Their faces were blank, their eyes lifeless. But then they all began to smile, their lips stretching impossibly wide as if their faces were about to tear apart. I spun around and bolted. I didn't look back. The sounds of the carnival became distorted, warping into an awful, guttural cacophony. As I neared the exit, the gates slammed shut, the lights flickering out one by one, plunging the place into darkness. I banged on the gates, shouting for help, but no one responded. The silence was suffocating, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. I turned to the side and noticed a sign I hadn't seen before. It read, "No one leaves." Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. Cold, clammy fingers gripped me, and I turned to find the man in the carnival worker's uniform standing behind me once more. His smile was wider than before. "You were always meant to be here," he whispered. Before I could scream, everything went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, heart still racing. The morning light filtered through my window. I shakily reached for my phone to check the time, but then I saw the notification. It was a photo from last night. A photo of me standing near the Ferris wheel, smiling wide, a smile that wasn't mine. The caption read, "Welcome to the carnival." I was helping my friend Mia clean out her grandmother's house. It had been left untouched for years, and the air inside smelled of dust, mildew, and forgotten time. Mia's grandmother had passed, and the house was to be sold. It was one of those old, creaky homes. Everything about it seemed heavy with history. We started in the basement. Mia warned me not to go down there alone, but I didn't think much of it. The basement had been a storage space for old furniture and junk, and it was pretty cramped. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the air cooler and damper with each step. The flickering light bulb overhead buzzed, casting long shadows across the clutter. There were boxes piled everywhere, some so old they were barely holding together. I started sifting through them, looking for anything of value, when something caught my eye. Tucked behind a stack of old newspapers was a small door, hidden, almost secret. It was a wooden door with rusted hinges, slightly ajar, and I immediately felt a chill run down my spine. I don't know why I felt the way I did, but there was something about that door. It didn't belong. "Mia," I called, but my voice came out soft, muffled by the thick walls. I decided to investigate anyway. I pushed the door open slowly, and as it creaked, I was hit with an overwhelming, suffocating smell, like wet earth, old blood, and something rotting. It was a small room beyond, almost like a crawl space. The floor was covered in dirt and what looked like old stains, like someone had spilled something and never cleaned it up. On the far wall, there was a rusted iron cage. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong in a house. The bars were covered in layers of dust, and inside the cage were old, tattered clothes, a few scattered objects, and something else. Something I couldn't immediately make out. I stepped closer, the unease building in my chest. I bent down to get a better look, and then I saw it. In the corner of the cage, barely visible beneath the junk, was a small, cracked mirror. But it wasn't like a normal mirror. It was warped, twisted almost, as if it was distorting everything around it. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers brushed the glass, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder. The buzzing light bulb above me flickered violently. I pulled my hand back, and for a moment, everything went still. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure in the mirror. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but no, it wasn't. The figure was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with fear, her hands pressed against the glass. She was trapped, staring back at me with an expression that chilled me to the bone. I staggered back, heart pounding. I blinked hard, but when I looked again, the woman was gone. The mirror reflected only the dim, dusty room. "Mia!" I shouted. Again, my voice panicked now. There was no response. I rushed out of the small room, back to the stairs, but something stopped me. From the corner of my eye, I saw the basement door creak closed on its own. The temperature dropped even further. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like something, or someone, was holding it shut. I pounded on it, trying to force it open, but the air grew heavier, thicker, suffocating. Suddenly, the lights went out. Complete darkness. I froze. A soft noise like dragging footsteps echoed through the basement. I couldn't move. Then, I heard something else. A whisper, faint but clear, coming from right behind me. "You shouldn't have opened it," the voice said, cold and raspy, as though it had been waiting to speak for a long time. I didn't wait to hear more. I screamed and shoved the door open with every ounce of strength I had left. The basement stairs were a blur as I ran up, my legs shaking. When I burst into the main house, Mia was there, wide-eyed, staring at me. "What happened?" she asked, but I couldn't explain it. I couldn't even look back toward the basement. Later, when we were leaving, I turned for one last glance at the house. The lights were on in the basement again, flickering as though inviting someone to return. But I wasn't going back. Not ever. And as I left the street, I saw, for just a moment, the reflection of a woman in the window, her eyes wide with that same haunting look. I never wanted to go to the theater, but my friend insisted. It was an old place, dark and mysterious. The kind of building where you'd feel a chill even if it wasn't cold outside. The kind of theater that had been abandoned for decades, until the owners decided to reopen it. They were offering a special screening, and the tickets were cheap, so of course we went. We stood in front of the faded marquee, the lights barely working, flickering in and out. The entrance door was a heavy wooden thing that creaked as we opened it, revealing a lobby filled with dust. The air felt stale, and a faint smell of mildew mixed with old velvet hung in the air. It was the kind of place that felt as though it had been trapped in time, frozen in the past. Maybe this place should have stayed closed, I muttered, looking around at the cracked walls and peeling wallpaper. But my friend, Dan, was already leading the way up the grand staircase to the balcony. "It's just a movie, man. What's the worst that could happen?" he said with a laugh. The theater itself was enormous. The seats, once plush, were now just tattered cushions held together by ancient fabric. The stage was set, but there was a strange stillness to the room. The air felt too heavy, as if the building itself was waiting for something to happen. We sat near the front, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Every creak of the wooden floors, every whisper of the wind outside, felt amplified in this forsaken place. The lights dimmed, the screen flickered to life, and the movie began. But it wasn't the usual feature. The first few minutes seemed normal, some strange black and white film. But then something odd happened. The characters in the movie started looking directly at us, their eyes turning to the screen as if they could see us sitting there, their faces twisted into disturbing smiles, their eyes wide and unnatural. I glanced at Dan, but he was entranced, his eyes fixed on the screen, completely unaware. I turned back to the movie, but now the images on the screen began to change. The shadows in the theater grew longer, and the air seemed to thicken. The actors started to speak in a language I didn't understand, their voices distorted, as though they were coming from somewhere deep within the building. Suddenly, I heard a whisper, low and distant, just over my shoulder. My heart raced. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty, decaying rows of seats behind us. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come." A chill ran down my spine. The room seemed to grow colder with every passing second. The lights flickered above us, and I heard something moving in the darkness, something shuffling in the aisles. I dared not look, but I could feel the presence, an unseen force just out of view, closing in around us. The movie on the screen started distorting, flashing in rapid succession, frames of dark faces, twisted shapes, and empty eyes. It was like they were coming for us, reaching out from the screen. And then, one by one, the seats around us began to creak, as though someone invisible was sitting down beside us. I grabbed Dan's arm, shaking him. "Dan, we need to leave. This isn't right." But he didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the screen, his face pale and frozen. The whispers grew louder, clearer. "You shouldn't have come." I stood up, heart pounding, and looked around. The exits. Where were the exits? They weren't where they had been before. The doors had vanished, replaced with walls of blackness. The entire theater was shifting, closing in on us. I felt a pull, something cold, something dark, dragging me toward the stage. It was as if the building itself had come alive, as if the walls wanted to swallow me whole. "Dan!" I shouted, but my voice was drowned out by the growing whispers, now joined by screams, wailing, as if the building itself was crying out in pain. In a blur of panic, I turned and ran toward the back of the theater, but as I did, the movie screen flickered once more. This time, I saw them, not just on the screen, but in the theater, standing on the stage. The characters from the film, twisted versions of them, grinning at me, their eyes burning with malice. I burst through a door I hadn't noticed before, finding myself in a narrow hallway leading to what seemed like a backstage area. But the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. And then it came. The one final whisper, now so close it was as though someone was breathing down my neck. "You're not leaving." I spun around to face the darkness. But when I did, the hallway was empty. The door I had come through was gone. The whispers, the shadows, everything had vanished. I stumbled out of the theater, heart still racing, desperate to escape. When I turned back, I saw the building standing silent, dark and still in the distance. And as I walked away, I saw it on the marquee, flashing in faint, flickering lights. The end. I hadn't planned to stay the night, but when my car broke down on a desolate highway, the only place for miles was an old, crumbling hotel. The neon sign outside buzzed intermittently, flickering as if it was barely hanging on. The building had an eerie, forgotten air about it, but it was late and I had no choice. The clerk behind the front desk was an old man, his eyes deep-set and weary. He didn't speak much, just handed me the key with a faint smile. Room 208, the hallway smelled of stale carpet and dust, as if the hotel hadn't seen guests in years. The walls were stained, the air thick with something musty. I felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the temperature. I brushed it off and entered the room, locking the door behind me. The room was plain. Too plain. The bed was made, the curtains drawn, but the oddest thing was the large mirror on the wall opposite the bed. It wasn't particularly beautiful or ornate, just a large, dusty, rectangular mirror framed in dark wood. I shrugged it off and sat on the bed, unpacking my things. After a while, I turned the TV on, but the signal was fuzzy. I sighed, turning it off, and then lay back, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't long before I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was the pipes, maybe an old house settling. But as the tapping grew louder, I realized it was coming from the mirror. I sat up, my heart racing. The mirror. Something was moving in it. My reflection was still, but behind me, just barely noticeable, was the figure of a man, standing there, watching me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath caught in my throat and I rushed to the mirror, heart pounding. But there was nothing behind me now. Just the reflection of an empty room. I laughed nervously, thinking I had imagined it. But then the tapping came again, louder this time, unmistakable. I couldn't help myself. I turned back to the mirror, and there he was again, that figure, standing motionless behind me, his face pale and gaunt. He wasn't just a reflection. He was real. His eyes locked with mine. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the phone and tried to dial the front desk, but the line was dead. I bolted toward the door, but the handle wouldn't turn. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one came. Then the tapping stopped. I turned back to the mirror. The man was gone, but I was no longer alone in the reflection. There, standing in the mirror, was a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow, her lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I knew instantly. I'd seen her before. She was the old hotel clerk. She had never been behind the desk when I checked in, and she wasn't smiling anymore. The reflection of the room was wrong, too. The walls were cracked, the window boarded up. The mirror had turned into a window into another place, an abandoned hotel where no one had lived for years. I backed away slowly, not daring to take my eyes off the mirror. That's when I saw her. Closer now. Her hand reached out from the glass, fingers stretched toward me, the nails long and sharp. I screamed and ran to the door again, but it still wouldn't open. Desperation took over, and I hurled myself at the window, crashing through the glass into the dark night outside. I didn't stop running until I reached the highway. I never went back to that hotel. The car was fixed the next morning, and I left. without even thinking about staying anywhere near that place again. But there's something I can't forget. The clerk, the pale woman in the mirror, her smile, and the reflection that was never really mine. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I was the only one who made it out, and if the person still looking back at me in mirrors is really me. I was traveling alone on an overnight train to a city I didn't know well. The kind of journey you take when you're looking for something, even if you're not quite sure what. I settled into my seat, tucked against the window, watching the countryside blur by in the fading light. The train wasn't crowded, just a few other passengers here and there. I dozed off for a while, the rhythmic clacking of the wheels lulling me into a comfortable haze. But when I woke, something felt off. I glanced around. The lights in my car were dim, flickering occasionally as the train sped along. Most of the other passengers had vanished. In their place, there was a tall man at the far end of the car, standing still with his back to me, staring out the window. His presence unsettled me, though I couldn't quite figure out why. It wasn't that he looked dangerous, he was just wrong. Something about the way he stood, as if he was waiting for something, or someone. His long, dark coat seemed out of place, especially when most of the other passengers had worn comfortable travel clothes. I had the odd feeling that he didn't belong on this train. I stood up, planning to walk to the next car, but as soon as I took a step, I heard the screeching sound of metal on metal. The train lurched and the lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. My heart skipped. I froze. Was this normal? I hadn't heard anything over the intercom, and no one had reacted. It was too quiet. I could barely see anything, but I could hear him now, the sound of the man slowly turning around, the faint rustle of his coat, his footsteps soft but deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to locate him in the dark. Then the lights flickered back on, only this time they were dimmer, the entire car suffocating in a dull, sickly glow. The man was still there, but now he was standing much closer to me. His face was hidden in shadow, his eyes two dark pools that seemed to swallow the light. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was watch as he took a slow step forward, the sound of his footfalls growing louder in the heavy silence. He stopped just in front of me, close enough that I could feel the air shift. Then, in a voice that didn't seem to come from his mouth, he whispered, "They're waiting for you." I took a step back, my body finally reacting. I turned and bolted toward the next car. The door wouldn't open. I yanked the handle over, my pulse pounding in my ears. The entire car felt wrong, as if the train itself had become a trap, the air thick with something I couldn't name. From behind me, I heard the scrape of metal on metal. The man was moving again. Faster this time, his footsteps echoing through the car like a hunter closing in. I screamed, shoving harder at the door. The next car. I had to get to the next car. Finally, the door gave way with a squeal, and I stumbled into the next car, breathing hard, my heart racing. It was quiet again, and I paused, catching my breath. I looked around. The car was empty. Just a few scattered, passengers sleeping in their seats. No one had noticed the lights flicker, the tension I'd felt. I sank into a seat, trying to calm myself, but that's when I realized there was something off about this car, too. It wasn't just empty. It was wrong, in a deeper way. The seats were too old, the carpet worn beyond belief, the windows cracked, and there in the back corner was the man again. But now, he wasn't standing. He was sitting in one of the seats, watching me, his eyes never leaving mine. I opened my mouth to yell, but the words caught in my throat. The man's lips curled into a smile, the skin stretching tight over his teeth as if he knew something I didn't. "You'll never reach your destination," he whispered again, but this time the words came from all around me. The train seemed to hum with them, as if the entire vehicle was alive, watching, waiting. The car around me started to fade, disintegrate, as if the train was collapsing in on itself. I scrambled to my feet, panicked, trying to escape, but the train had already stopped. The platform outside was empty. The city wasn't there anymore. Just an endless black void. I was trapped, surrounded by the hum of the train that didn't belong to this world, with no way out. I wasn't planning on taking the last train. I'd stayed out later than expected, my phone battery dead, and the weather had turned colder than usual. By the time I reached the station, it was almost empty. The final train of the night was about to depart. It would be a long ride home, but I decided to get on anyway, figuring I could catch some sleep. The train car was almost completely deserted, with only a few scattered passengers. I found a seat by the window and settled in, staring out at the darkened tracks. The usual sounds of the train, the low hum of the engine, and the occasional rattle of the wheels put me at ease. It was peaceful, and soon enough my eyelids grew heavy. That's when I noticed something strange. The train stopped at an unfamiliar station. The platform was empty, no lights, no people, just an unsettling quiet that hung in the air. But it wasn't the station itself that caught my attention. It was the figure standing near the tracks. A tall man, dressed in a long coat, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. He was motionless, just staring at the train. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The train doors didn't open, and the man didn't move. The conductor came over the intercom, but the announcement was garbled, the words unintelligible. Then the train jolted forward again, and the man was gone from view. Tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just my imagination, but something didn't feel right. I glanced around the car. Everyone else seemed to be asleep or lost in their own world. Then I noticed something even stranger. The person sitting across from me wasn't there anymore. The seat was empty, but their bag was still on the floor, untouched. I looked back out the window. The same man was now standing by the next station, even farther down the tracks. He stood perfectly still, watching the train. My heart began to race. Why was he there? How had he gotten ahead of us so quickly? The train continued to speed through the dark, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and closed my eyes, hoping to sleep through the rest of the ride. But before I could drift off, I heard footsteps approaching from behind me. I turned to see a woman in the seat across from me wearing an old-fashioned dress. She was staring straight ahead, not acknowledging me at all. Her face was pale, gaunt, and her eyes were completely black. The air in the car grew heavier, colder. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, she was gone. The seat was empty, but the smell of decay lingered in the air. That's when the train made a hard stop. The lights flickered, and the overhead announcements were distorted, barely audible. The air felt thick, like the train was no longer moving in the real world. Then I heard a voice, soft, whispering from the darkness. "Get off." I spun around, searching for the source, but no one was there. The voice came again, closer this time. "Get off. Now." I could feel my heart pounding, my breath quickening. The train began moving again, but it felt wrong, off in some way that I couldn't explain. I grabbed my bag, my hands shaking. I had to get off the train. I ran down the aisle, but the doors didn't open. There was no stop, no platform in sight, just an endless stretch of black. The train speeding forward. My panic grew. The shadows around me seemed to move, as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Get off, or you'll stay here forever." Suddenly, the train screeched to a halt. The lights went out completely, plunging the car into darkness. I stumbled forward, trying to reach the door, when I heard a voice again, right behind me. "Stay with us." I whirled around, but there was no one. The voice, cold and hollow, echoed in the empty car. In a blur of panic, I slammed my hand on the door release. The doors finally slid open, and I leaped off the train onto the dark platform. I stood there, breathless, staring at the now stationary train. It was silent, completely still. The doors were wide open, yet no one was getting off. No one was getting on. Just the soft, eerie hum of the train sitting in the dark. I turned and ran. Into the night, away from that platform, away from the train that would never stop. I never took another late-night train again. We rented a remote cabin in the mountains, far from everything. No phone signal, no distractions, just a cozy spot by the fire with hot cocoa and good company. The drive up was long, the roads winding through snow-covered trees, and as we reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the frozen landscape. The cabin looked charming enough, old, wooden, and weathered by time, but sturdy. Once inside, we started a fire, unpacked our things, and made ourselves comfortable. The air was cold, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones. But the fire kept the cabin warm enough. We spent the evening talking and laughing, but as the night dragged on, a strange feeling settled in. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was more like unease, a nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Around midnight, we decided to go to bed. I took the room at the end of the hallway, farthest from the others, and settled in under the heavy blankets. The wind howled outside, the snow hitting the windows with force. I must have fallen asleep quickly, but I woke up to a sound, a soft tap, tap, tap on my door. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the old house creaking in, the cold. But then it came again, louder, more distinct. I sat up, my heart racing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. There was no answer. The sound stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming, down the hall. The door to my room creaked open, just a sliver, and I held my breath, waiting. Nothing. I was about to call out again when I heard a voice, soft but clear. "Help me." My blood ran cold. It wasn't any of my friends. The voice was faint, almost like a whisper, and it was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I couldn't call anyone. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated. I wanted to run to the others, but my feet felt like they were glued to the floor. I finally mustered enough courage to peek through the crack in the door. The hallway was empty, the shadows deep and suffocating. The only light was from the dim glow of the fireplace at the far end of the cabin. Then I saw it. A figure standing by the stairs, almost hidden in the darkness. It wasn't one of my friends. The figure was tall and thin, its limbs unnaturally long, with skin that looked pale and stretched tight against its bones. It was staring right at me. I slammed the door shut, heart racing. The footsteps began again, faster this time, coming closer. There was a knock on my door, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it was a frantic pounding, as if someone, or something, was desperate to get in. I backed away from the door, my mind screaming to leave, but my feet wouldn't move. I heard the voice again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was louder, more insistent. "Let me in." Suddenly, the door burst open and I stumbled back in terror. The figure stood in the doorway, its face obscured by shadows. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt them on me. Cold, empty, like it was staring into my very soul. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the heavy silence of the cabin. I ran past the figure, through the hallway, and into the living room, where my friends were still asleep. I tried to wake them, but no matter how hard I shook them, they wouldn't respond. They were frozen, their eyes wide open but unblinking, staring at nothing. I looked back toward the hallway. The figure was gone. The door to my room was closed. I rushed to the front door, but it wouldn't open. The locks were jammed as if something, or someone, was holding it shut. I don't know how long I spent trying to get out. I don't remember exactly when I started hearing the whispers, soft at first, but growing louder. It was the same voice, the one that had asked for help. "Let me in," it begged. I ran outside, through the snow, into the freezing night. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, hours away, my clothes soaked with snow and my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I never went back to that cabin. I've heard rumors since, whispers of people who've stayed there and never returned, of others who left with their minds shattered, too terrified to speak of what they saw. But I know what I heard, what I saw. I know what came knocking at my door. The storm hit unexpectedly. One moment, the sky was clear, and the next, a blanket of clouds rolled in from the sea, turning the ocean into a frothing beast. I was halfway through my trip when I saw the lighthouse on the cliff, a silhouette against the darkening horizon. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and I could barely see through the rain, but I decided to stop for shelter. The lighthouse wasn't in operation anymore, just an old structure with a rusty iron door that creaked on its hinges, but it looked sturdy enough and I needed to wait out the storm. I knocked on the door, unsure if anyone would even be around, but it opened almost immediately. An old man stood there, thin and gaunt, his skin pale as if he hadn't seen the sun in years. His clothes were weathered, and his eyes, wide, unblinking, held a kind of wildness that unsettled me. "Storm's bad," he rasped, stepping aside to let me in without a word more. Best not to stay outside. I hesitated, but something about his voice, thick with urgency, made me step inside. The place smelled of salt, mildew, and something metallic, like rusted metal. The walls were lined with old lanterns, each one still glowing dimly in the corner. The man led me into a small sitting room where a fire crackled faintly in the hearth. "You're the first visitor I've had in years," he said, his eyes flicking to the windows, as if something beyond the glass might be watching. "Stay the night if you like. The storm's too fierce to be out there." I nodded, grateful for the shelter, though uneasy under his watchful gaze. As the storm raged outside, the man spoke little, occasionally muttering about the sea and the things that had come from it. His words didn't make much sense, but I didn't press him. After a while, I made my way to the window. The rain beat against the glass and the waves crashed violently onto the rocks below. That's when I saw it. A figure standing on the rocks, just outside the reach of the waves. A person. It wasn't the old man, and it didn't seem like anyone I knew. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the figure was barely visible, a shadow in the storm. "Who's out there?" I asked, my voice shaky. The old man was standing behind me before I could turn around, his face too close to mine. "No, one should be out there," he whispered, his breath cold against my neck. "Not in that place." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the figure. Something about it felt wrong, unnatural. "Are you sure? It's a person?" I asked, my voice wavering. The man didn't answer at first. His gaze was locked on the window, but his body was rigid, his hands trembling. He finally spoke, his voice lower now like a whisper in the dark. "I've lived here for years, you know, and there's something you should know about this place." His words hung in the air, heavy and foreboding. "Once the storm starts, the keeper comes," he continued, his eyes flicking to the window again. "But the keeper is not a man. He's something else." I turned back to the window. The figure was closer now, standing still as the waves crashed around it, unmoving. My heart skipped a beat. "You're not making sense," I said, my voice trembling. "Who is it?" He took a deep breath. "The keeper used to be a man. Long ago, before I took this job. He kept watch over the lighthouse, watching the sea for ships, for dangers. But he didn't leave when the others did. They say the sea claimed him, but he never truly left. He stays out there, waiting." Suddenly, the figure moved, its body jerking unnaturally, as if being pulled by invisible strings. It walked toward the lighthouse, its movements stiff and inhuman. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The old man grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Get away from the window. It sees you. It knows you're here." But it was too late. The figure had reached the base of the lighthouse. The storm had stopped, and the silence was unbearable. Then a knock, sharp, deliberate, on the door. I froze. The old man didn't move, his eyes wide with fear. He whispered, "He's come for you." I turned, my heart racing. The door shook. Under the force of the knock, louder now, almost as if it were being pounded. I didn't know what to do. I didn't understand. The keeper wasn't just some legend, some haunting tale. He was real, and he was here. Without another thought, I ran to the door and flung it open, only to find nothing but the dark, empty night. There was no figure, no storm, just the cold, eerie silence of the lighthouse. And in that moment, I realized the truth. There was no storm. There was no sea. There was only the keeper, and he had never left. I never meant to be there. It was supposed to be a one-night stay at a remote inn in the mountains, an isolated, cozy retreat from the chaos of city life. But the moment I arrived, I felt something was wrong. The inn was tucked in a valley, surrounded by towering, mist-covered trees. It had an old-world charm, but something about the place made me uneasy. The wooden sign swayed in the breeze, creaking eerily. I stood there for a moment. The only sound, the distant rush of water in the stream nearby. Inside, the lobby smelled of old wood and something metallic. The receptionist, an older woman with a crooked smile, greeted me. "Welcome," she said, her voice raspy. "You're the last one tonight." I assumed she meant that I was the last check-in of the day, but something about her words seemed heavier, laden with an unspoken meaning. Still, I brushed it off, trying to focus on the warm fire burning in the hearth. She handed me a key, a simple brass one, and said, "Room 7. It's the only one left. Room 7. I headed up the creaky stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty hall. As I passed the other rooms, I noticed they were all shut tight. No sounds, no lights. I finally reached my room and unlocked the door. Inside, the bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn, the room quiet and still. But something was off. The air was too cold, the light too dim. The only source of warmth was the small, flickering lamp on the nightstand. I tried to shake it off. I unpacked my things, decided to relax with a book, and left the door slightly ajar in case I wanted to explore. But as the minutes dragged on, I noticed an odd sensation creeping over me, like I wasn't alone in the room. The hairs on my neck prickled. I glanced over my shoulder. The door had creaked open wider, though I hadn't moved. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up and walked toward the door, my breath shallow, but when I peered outside, the hallway was empty. Still, something felt wrong. The silence was suffocating. I returned to the bed and tried to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping on the door. Tap, tap, tap. My stomach dropped. I stared at the door, too afraid to move. Then the tapping grew louder, more urgent. Tap, 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 like fingers desperately scraping against the wood. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. There was no reply, only silence. I slowly made my way to the door, my hand gripping the brass handle. With one swift motion, I swung it open. Nothing. The hallway was dark, empty. The sound had stopped. I glanced down at the floor. It was spotless, no sign of anyone being there. I was about to shut the door when I noticed something strange. A small, smudged handprint on the inside of the doorframe, barely visible in the dim light. Chills ran down my spine. Who had touched it? I backed away from the door, trying to make sense of it. And then, Just as I turned to face the room again, I heard a soft voice, a whisper, directly behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. I rushed to the window and yanked back the curtains. The view outside had changed. The once peaceful moonlit valley was now shrouded in fog, and in the distance, a figure stood motionless in the mist. I blinked. The figure was gone. I grabbed my things, deciding to leave the inn immediately. I raced down the stairs, my feet pounding against the wooden steps, but as I reached the lobby, I froze. The receptionist was no longer behind the desk. In her place was a tall, dark figure, its face obscured by shadow. "Leaving so soon?" the figure asked, its voice smooth, almost inviting. I stumbled back. What's going on here?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped forward, revealing a thin, ghastly smile stretched unnaturally across its face. I tried to run, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked. "Guests never leave," the figure whispered, its voice low, menacing. In a blind panic, I turned toward the nearest window, but the glass was fogged up, the mist thickening around it. The lobby seemed to shift, growing darker, as if the building itself was closing in on me. "You were always meant to stay." The voice was now a chorus, multiple voices merging together, growing louder. I turned back to the door and pushed with everything I had, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, its smile stretching wider, the eyes hollow and empty. Just as it reached for me, the door slammed open. I didn't hesitate. I ran, charging into the night, the cold air rushing over me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. I drove away, not looking back, but the one thing I'll never forget is the sound. The tapping. It didn't stop. It followed me all the way home. And when I looked, in the rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw a red glow, fading into the distance. It was the last guest. And I had just checked in. I had never planned on staying at my aunt's house. It wasn't a place anyone would willingly spend more time than necessary. Tucked away on a desolate hill, surrounded by overgrown trees and an endless stretch of wild, untamed land, the house always gave off a strange vibe. Aunt Clara had left it to me when she passed, with no other family around. I didn't want it, but I couldn't sell it either. She had left me a note that said, "You'll understand when the time comes." I arrived late one evening, rain pouring in sheets, the sky dark and heavy. The house loomed ahead, windows dark as though it was waiting for me. The wind howled through the trees, and the front door creaked open on its own as if it were greeting me. Inside, the air was cold and damp. The musty smell hit me immediately, mixed with something metallic, almost like copper. I shuddered, but shrugged it off as the usual dust. The house looked unchanged, as if Aunt Clara had just stepped out for a walk. But something about the silence felt wrong. The house had always been quiet, but this was different. The walls seemed to hum, the floors groaning under my feet like something beneath was stirring. I chalked it up to the wind and tried to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping up my spine. I made my way to the old kitchen, which still had traces of Aunt Clara's presence. Her tea kettle sat on the counter, dusty but intact. I set my bag down, ready to call it a night. But then I heard something, a soft scraping noise from the hallway. At first, I thought it was a branch scraping against the window, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart skipped as I stood still, listening. The scraping continued, followed by a faint whisper, just barely audible. I crept out into the hallway, trying to convince myself it was the wind again. The sound came from the attic, a place I had always avoided as a child. But now, with no choice but to investigate, I slowly made my way up the narrow staircase. The attic door was ajar, and as I approached, the whispering grew louder, but still unintelligible. I hesitated. The air colder here, the shadows deeper. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The attic was empty. No boxes, no old furniture. But something was wrong. The floorboards groaned under an invisible weight, and in the corner there was something I hadn't noticed before. A single red lantern. It sat on the floor, unlit, but its presence filled the room with an oppressive, suffocating heat. I stepped closer to it, but as I did, the whispering stopped. Everything was dead quiet except for my own breathing, shallow and rapid. I reached out and touched the lantern. The second my fingers made contact, the entire room seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew unbearably thick. Then the lantern flickered to life. It wasn't the warm glow I expected. No. The flame inside was a deep, unnatural red, and the light it cast seemed to pull the shadows toward it, like dark tendrils wrapping around my legs. A voice, low and guttural, whispered my name. It was no longer faint, it was clear, and it came from behind me. I turned quickly, my heart racing. There, standing in the doorway of the attic, was a figure, a man. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel his gaze piercing through me. I opened my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. The figure stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark, as if they reflected the lantern's flame. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice sending a cold shiver through my body. I tried to move, but my feet were frozen to the floor. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. He stepped forward again, his feet barely making a sound, and as he did, I felt something in the room shift. The temperature dropped even further, and I could see my breath clouding in front of me. The man reached up slowly and removed his hood. His face was not human. It was pale, stretched, with hollow black eyes that seemed to suck in the light. His mouth curled into a twisted grin as he reached out toward me, the air crackling with a strange energy. "You were chosen," he whispered, his fingers brushing my cheek, "to be the last." The lantern flared brighter, and I screamed. My legs finally moved, and I bolted for the door. As I ran down the stairs, I glanced over my shoulder. The figure was gone, but I could still hear his voice, faint, echoing through the house. "You can't leave." I burst out of the house, heart pounding, the rain still falling in sheets. I ran until my legs burned, until I could no longer hear the whispers, until the house was nothing but a dark silhouette in the distance. I never went back to the house after that night. I moved far away to a small apartment where I could breathe, without the constant weight on my chest. But sometimes, when the air grows heavy and the wind howls just right, I hear the whispers again. And I know they're still watching. And I was never meant to leave. I had just finished my shift at the diner and was walking home when I noticed the strange house on the corner. I'd passed it 100 times before, but tonight it felt different. The windows were dark, the yard untouched by the usual city noise, and yet something about it seemed to call to me. I shrugged it off, convincing myself it was just the exhaustion creeping in. But, as I passed, I heard it, a soft tapping, like nails on wood. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again, clearer this time, from inside the house. Curiosity gnawed at me. I shouldn't have, but I stepped up the creaky steps to the porch. The front door, old and weathered, stood slightly ajar. No lights, just the darkness and the tapping, persistent as a heartbeat. My hand shook as I reached for the doorknob. I opened it just a crack, peering inside. The air was heavy, smelling of old wood and something sharp, like iron. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment everything felt still. "Hello?" I called, my voice almost lost in the vastness of the empty hallway. No response. I pushed the door open fully, stepping inside. The room was eerily silent. There were no signs of life, just dust-covered furniture, faded wallpaper peeling off the walls. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere deep inside the house. I froze. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Slowly, I turned and moved toward the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway stretched ahead, dark and endless. At the far end, a door creaked open, the shadow of a figure standing just beyond it. A cold draft swept past me. "Who's there?" I whispered. The figure stepped forward, and I felt the breath leave my body. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to sink deeper the longer I looked at them. Her hair hung in thin strands, her dress tattered and old, as if it had been pulled straight from another time. "You shouldn't be here," she rasped. I stumbled backward, nearly falling over the rotting floorboards, but I couldn't move fast enough. The woman took a step closer, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that froze me in place. "Leave," she whispered again, but this time there was something darker in her tone, something commanding. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows warping and twisting. The tapping returned, louder now, as if something was pounding inside the walls. "Please go," she begged, her voice growing frantic. And then I understood. The tapping wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Suddenly, the floorboards groaned. With a horrific crack, one of them gave way, and I saw it. Something thin, long, and twisted, reaching up from the darkness below, its fingers scratching, clawing their way toward me. Before I could scream, the woman lunged, grabbing my wrist with a grip like iron. Her nails dug into my skin, her breath hot against my ear. "You have to leave now." Before it, the floor gave way beneath me and I fell. I tumbled down into the dark, a sharp pain shooting through my body as I landed in a cold, damp space. My head spun, my vision blurred. The woman's voice echoed in my mind. "Before it finds you." I struggled to get to my feet. I was in a basement, but not one I recognized. The walls were covered in old, fraying sheets of fabric, their edges torn like the remnants of forgotten lives. And at the far end of the room, an old mirror hung on the wall. I didn't want to look. I knew something was wrong. But something about the mirror called to me, compelled me to turn toward it. As I did, I saw her reflection standing behind me, her eyes wide with terror. But there was something else in the reflection, something worse. A figure, dark and looming, moved in, the shadows behind her. It was tall, impossibly tall, with thin, spindly limbs. Its face was an empty void, no features, no eyes, just darkness. The figure reached out, its hand hovering over the woman's shoulder. "Run," she whispered in the reflection, her mouth moving in slow motion. I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted for the stairs, my heart hammering in my chest. The tapping grew louder again, now frantic like it was chasing me. I reached the stairs and scrambled up, my legs aching with every step. When I burst through the door and back into the hallway, the house felt different. The woman was gone, and the atmosphere had shifted, as though the entire place had become alive with something hungry. I didn't look back as I ran out of the house and into the night. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the yard. I didn't stop until I was safely back at my apartment. But even now, every night, I hear the tapping. And every night, I feel those empty eyes watching me. And sometimes, when the night is too quiet, I hear her voice, soft and desperate, whispering through the walls. "Leave, before it finds you." It was an old house, set at the top of a forgotten hill on the outskirts of town. No one had lived there for years, or so the locals said. They warned me about it, but I never listened to warnings. The house intrigued me, a crumbling relic of the past, its windows dark like eyes watching over the town. I had just moved into a small apartment nearby. and the house was hard to ignore. Every time I passed it, something about the place tugged at my curiosity. One foggy evening, I couldn't resist any longer. I decided to explore. The gate creaked open, and I stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the house. The air was thick, heavy, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. The house loomed ahead, its broken windows like hollow sockets, and its front door stood ajar, as if inviting me in. I hesitated, but pushed forward, my heart racing. Inside, the floorboards groaned under my feet. Dust hung in the air, and the smell of mildew and decay made my stomach churn. I could feel something watching me. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional drip of water somewhere deep inside. I wandered through the rooms, my flashlight illuminating old portraits that seemed to follow me with their eyes. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and the furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust, looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But something felt off, like the house wasn't completely abandoned. Then I found the door. It was in the back of the house, hidden behind a crumbling staircase. The door was different from the others. Unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't decayed or rotting. It was solid, unmarked, and the faintest glow of light leaked from under it. I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. The door opened, with a loud creak. What I saw beyond it made my blood run cold. The room was empty, except for a single object in the center, a red lantern. It burned with a strange flickering light, casting shadows on the walls. The room was unnaturally cold, and I felt an inexplicable urge to step inside. As soon as I did, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the room was different now. The walls were no longer decaying. They were perfectly intact, and the windows, once broken, now gleamed with the light of day. I tried the door, but it was locked. The red lantern flickered again, its light growing brighter, casting twisted, moving shadows around the room. I could feel something closing in on me. And then I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It came from behind me. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. The voice wasn't human. It was distorted, like it was being spoken through a wall. Panic surged through me. I whipped around, searching for the source, but there was nothing. The room remained empty, save for the lantern. But the shadows had changed. They were moving, shifting, crawling toward me like living things. I backed away from the lantern, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. That's when I saw them. The figures. At first, they were just shapes, flickering in and out of sight, but then they took form. People, ghostly, translucent figures, stood at the edges of the room, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. They didn't speak, but I could feel their presence, like they were waiting for something. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I tried to break down the door again, but it wouldn't budge. The lantern's glow grew stronger, the shadows crawling faster toward me. Then, one of the figures moved. Slowly, deliberately, it reached for the lantern. I screamed, throwing myself. At the door, desperately banging on it with both fists. "Help!" I screamed. "Someone, please!" But no one came. The room seemed to grow smaller, the shadows closing in on me. Just as the figure's hand touched the lantern, everything went still. The shadows froze. The whispers stopped. For a moment, I thought I might be free. Then the figure turned toward me. Its face was no longer blank. It was a twisted, grotesque mask, filled with horror. Its eyes were wide and black, its mouth twisted into a permanent scream. It spoke. "Now, you are one of us." I stumbled back in terror, but the figure lunged, and as its hands reached for me, I felt the world shift. Suddenly, I was outside again, standing on the front porch of the house. The door was shut tight, and the red lantern was gone. The sun had set, and the air felt normal again, but the unease remained. I left the house quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. When I glanced back, the house seemed to watch me. Its windows, now dark once more, felt like empty eyes, waiting, always waiting. I never went back to that house, but sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear a soft, whispering voice from the shadows. It always says the same thing. You shouldn't have come. I've always been the curious type, the kind of person who checks every nook and cranny when moving into a new place. So, when I first got the keys to my new apartment, I immediately began exploring every corner. The building was old, really old, filled with creaky floors, peeling paint, and that musty smell that always lingers in places untouched by time. It was late in the evening when I noticed something strange. A small, almost unnoticeable door in the back of the closet. It was hidden behind a stack of old boxes, and the knob was rusty. My heart raced as I ran my fingers over it. Why hadn't the landlord mentioned this? I pulled it open. It creaked loudly, more than I expected, and revealed a tiny, dark space. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a narrow crawl space, barely big enough for me to fit through. But there was something unsettling about the way the shadows clung to the walls. For some reason, I couldn't look away. The door had been closed for years, I was sure of it, but the air inside felt wrong. A sense of dread wrapped itself around my chest, squeezing tighter the longer I stared. I felt like something was watching me, and for a moment, I almost shut the door and pretended I hadn't seen it. But curiosity won. I grabbed a flashlight and squeezed through the opening. The space was cramped, and my knees scraped against the jagged edges of the walls. The flashlight flickered on and off, casting brief flashes of light on the crumbling wood around me. As I inched forward, I noticed a strange pattern carved into the walls. Symbols, marks that looked like they had been etched in a hurry, and some that seemed unnervingly fresh. Suddenly, I heard something soft, like a whisper. My heart skipped, and I froze. "Who's there?" I whispered into the darkness. No response. I pressed on, pushing through the suffocating air, my every movement feeling too loud. Then, just ahead, I noticed something. A figure, barely visible, standing in the far corner of the crawl space. At first, I thought it was a shadow, but as the light flickered again, I saw it clearer. A human shape, standing completely still, its face hidden in darkness. The hair on my neck stood up. "Hello?" I called again, but the figure didn't move. The whisper returned, louder this time. "Leave. Now." I turned around in a panic, only to realize I had no idea how to get back. The crawl space seemed to have stretched. What was once a short path now felt endless. My flashlight dimmed further, casting everything in a sickly glow. "Leave. Now. You've found me." The voice came from behind me. I spun around and the figure had moved. It was no longer standing still. It was right in front of me, close enough that I could hear its breath. Slow, labored, wet. I backed away, my pulse pounding. The flashlight flickered once more, and in that moment of darkness, I felt it. The cold fingers of something brushing against my skin. Something wet and cold, like flesh that had been submerged in ice water. I bolted forward, panic overtaking every sense. I scrambled back toward the entrance, but the space kept expanding, twisting. I couldn't find the way out. I kept running in circles, tripping over the uneven ground. "Please, don't." The voice came again, but now it wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, echoing off the walls. I pushed harder, heart racing, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. If I did, I was sure I'd see it. The thing that had been watching me. Finally, the flashlight went out. The world plunged into darkness. The whispers became roars, a cacophony of sounds that twisted together, all calling my name, begging me to stop. I didn't. Then, just as quickly as it had started, I felt the crawl space shift. I tumbled forward, crashing into the closet door, my hands scraping against the rough wood. The moment I pushed it open, I tumbled out into the room, gasping for air. The door slammed shut behind me, the darkness cutting off at once. I was back in my apartment. I didn't wait to take a breath. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "Is there anyone else in this building?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The landlord hesitated. "No. Why?" Then, "Who was in the walls?" There was a long pause on the other end. "What are you talking about?" Who was watching me from the crawlspace?" I demanded, feeling panic rising in my throat. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number was disconnected. I couldn't explain what had happened, but something told me I wasn't alone in this building anymore. Later that night, I heard the whisper again, this time from inside the walls. "You found me. Now you belong to me." I moved into my new apartment a few weeks ago, the one in the old brick building at the edge of town. The rent was cheap, and I wasn't picky. The place had its quirks, creaky floors, peeling wallpaper, but it was mine. I liked the solitude. It was the middle of the night when it first happened. I had just gotten into bed, my lights off, and the apartment silent, when I heard the knock. One knock, clear and deliberate. I froze. It came from the door. I thought it was a mistake, maybe a neighbor, but when I checked the peephole, no one was there. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm myself. Maybe I was just imagining things. I locked the door again and went back to bed, the silence thick in the air. A few nights later, the knock came again, just one. At first, I thought it was some prank, but as I stood in front of the door this time, I noticed something strange. The hallway light was flickering. It wasn't a power surge, more like something else, something unnatural, like it was struggling to stay on. My pulse quickened. I leaned in closer to the door and put my ear against it. The silence was almost suffocating until I heard a soft whisper. "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. There was no one out there. I backed away from the door, shaking. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat on the couch, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound, the next knock. I didn't hear anything for a while, but then, there it was. The knock came again, louder this time. I jumped. The apartment felt colder, the shadows seemed longer. But this time, I did something different. I grabbed a kitchen knife and slowly unlocked the door, heart hammering in my chest. When I opened it, I saw nothing. The hallway was empty, the light still flickering. There was no one there. I checked the other apartments, but no one was around. I closed the door, my mind racing. What was going on? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The knocks kept coming, always at night, always the same. One knock, and then that voice. "You're not alone." Finally, after days of sleepless nights, I decided to confront whatever it was. I waited, the knife in my hand, as the clock ticked toward midnight. As soon as the knock sounded, I rushed to the door, but this time, something was different. The door was moving on its own. It creaked open a fraction, and I could see a shadow through the gap. I didn't want to open it further, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand reached out and I pushed the door open completely. The hallway was darker now, darker than it had ever been. I could barely see anything, but then I saw it. There, standing at the end of the hall, a figure, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadows. It was wearing something that looked like an old, tattered coat, its arms long and unnaturally thin. I couldn't make out any features, just the shape of it standing still, waiting. For the first time, I felt pure terror. The thing didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence. I could feel it in my bones. I slammed the door shut. The knock came again, But this time, I didn't answer. Instead, I ran. I grabbed my things, my keys, and bolted out of the apartment, down the stairs, through the lobby. I didn't stop running until I was outside. I called the landlord the next morning, explained everything. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my stomach twist. "You're not the first to report this," he said. "The building, it has a history." "History?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The knock, the visitor. It's been here for years. Every tenant hears it. It's always the same. One knock, and then it shows up." I wanted to scream, but all I could do was hang up. I never went back. To this day, I never hear a knock when I'm at home. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone, I hear a whisper. You're not alone. I was driving alone through the back roads, far from the nearest town. The kind of roads that twisted like veins in the dark, where even your headlights seemed to struggle to light the way. It was late, past midnight, and the fog had rolled in thick. My windshield wipers fought against it, but the mist clung to the glass, blurring my vision. The radio was silent, not even static, just an empty hum. Then the voice crackled through. "Turn back," it whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. I slammed the volume dial, but the voice didn't stop. It continued, just a breath above the static. "Turn back. Now." I froze, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles went white. The voice was soft, eerily calm. No mistake, it came from the radio. But I knew no one had touched the dial. I had been alone in the car. I glanced at the road ahead, but it felt like I wasn't moving at all. My headlights barely pierced the fog, and something in my gut twisted. My heart raced, thudding like a drum. I wasn't sure if I should keep driving, but I pressed on. The fog thickened, and my car slowed of its own accord as though the road itself was pulling me in. The voice continued. "You're not alone." My eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. Nothing but white. But that's when I heard it. A low, whistling sound. Soft at first, like a breeze through the trees. But it was close. Too close. It was a tune, almost melodic but haunting, like a lullaby from a nightmare. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, but my pulse wouldn't slow. The road ahead twisted, the fog so dense now that it felt like a wall pressing in from all sides. The whistling grew louder. It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside the car, a slow, deliberate whistle, the kind that you'd hear from someone walking behind you, following you. I couldn't see anything in the rearview mirror. No shadow, no silhouette. But the sound was unmistakable. Someone was out there. I needed to get out of the fog, fast. But the more I drove, the more the whistling seemed to draw closer, matching my speed. Then, a sharp gust of wind slammed into my side window, rattling the glass. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter. That's when I saw it. A figure just ahead, standing by the side of the road. I nearly slammed on the brakes, hard in my throat, but I couldn't. I was frozen. The figure was tall, gaunt, its face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. A dark coat billowed in the mist around it, and in its hand was a lantern, a single flickering light, illuminating only the figure's shadowed form. I slammed the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just inches from the figure. The whistling stopped. Everything stopped. My headlights now illuminated the figure fully. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me from beneath the brim of the hat, the light from its lantern casting an eerie glow. I could barely breathe. It was as if time had frozen. But then it took a step forward. One slow, deliberate step. And that's when the radio blared to life again. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, urgent. "Run! Don't let it in!" The figure didn't move. It was still standing in the fog, but I could feel the air shift. A presence, a cold that made my bones ache. My foot was on the gas, before I could think. I didn't care anymore. I just needed to get away. My tires screamed against the gravel as I sped off, the figure disappearing into the mist behind me. I didn't stop again. I didn't look back. When I finally reached a gas station miles down the road, I didn't feel safe. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that something was still out there. The station attendant stared at me with wide eyes when I pulled up. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me like I was crazy. "Are you all right?" he asked finally, his voice shaking. I couldn't find words. I just pointed to the radio. The dial was still flickering, static, buzzing. He nodded grimly and reached behind the counter, pulling out an old map. "You didn't hear the whistling, did you?" he asked. I nodded slowly, my chest tight. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scribbled something on the map. "Stay on the main roads. Whatever you do, don't take the back roads at night. It calls to you." He handed me the map, his eyes full of something I couldn't name, something dark. "The Whistler doesn't let you leave once. You've heard it." I couldn't bring myself to ask him what that meant. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see that lantern's light, but the road behind me was empty. The voice on the radio never came back. The whistling never followed me again, but I never drove those back roads again. I don't even know what I would have done if I had, and I'll never forget that cold whisper, "You're not alone." I was alone in my apartment, something I rarely was. I usually liked the company of roommates, but everyone had gone out, and I had the place to myself. The quiet should have been a relief, but instead, it felt off, like the air was too still. It was late when I heard the first knock, soft, barely noticeable, but it was there. At first, I thought it was just the building settling, but then it came again. 3 sharp knocks at my front door. I froze. It was after midnight. No one should have been here. I checked the peephole, but there was no one there. The hallway outside was empty. I convinced myself I had imagined it, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks. But just as I turned away, there was a sudden, louder knock. I opened the door slowly, peering into the hall, still expecting no one. But there, just beyond the door, stood a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, dressed in a tattered suit, his hair wild and unkempt. His eyes were wide, unnaturally so, as though he hadn't blinked in hours, maybe days. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice shaky but sharp. "Can you help me?" Confused and a little scared, I stepped back. "Help you with what?" The man's eyes flickered toward the hallway. "I don't have anywhere to go. Can I stay with you, just for a little while?" I hesitated. Something about him made my skin crawl. But I couldn't just turn him away. He seemed desperate. I nodded reluctantly and let him inside. The moment the door closed behind him, I felt a shift in the air. It was as if the apartment had gotten colder, the shadows deeper. He sat down on the couch without a word, staring at the wall with a strange, vacant expression. I offered him a drink, but he didn't respond. The silence between us grew, heavy and unnerving. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice tight. His head snapped toward me, his gaze intense, almost piercing. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to stare. His lips moved, but the words didn't match the sound that came out. The voice didn't even seem like his. Too distorted, too hollow. "I can't leave," the voice said, not from his mouth, but from somewhere deeper inside him. I stood up quickly, my heart racing. "What do you mean, you can't leave?" Smiled, a slow, creeping smile that made my stomach twist. "I've been waiting for you, waiting for the invitation." I backed away, but the man stood up too, moving with an unnerving speed. His eyes glowed, but not in the way that made them appear alive, more like 2 black holes. The air grew colder, the shadows in the apartment stretching unnaturally long. The clock on the wall stopped ticking. "I don't know you," I gasped, my mind spiraling. "What do you want from me?" His lips curled into a smile that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm here to stay, whether you want me to or not. You opened the door." I ran to the front door, but it was locked. I yanked the handle, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around me seemed to close in, the room distorting. The man's distorted voice echoed from all around. "I'm part of you now," he said. "You invited me in." I turned, heart hammering in my chest. The man was standing directly behind me now, his breath cold against my neck. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty again. I ran out into the hallway, but the moment I stepped into the building's stairwell, I saw it. A figure standing at the end of the hall, tall, with wild hair, staring right at me. The same figure I had just seen. It was no longer a person. It was a shadow, a presence that loomed over me, suffocating and dark. I bolted down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty hall, but the figure was always one step behind me. No matter how fast I ran, it never got any farther away. By the time I reached the ground floor, the hall was silent again. The figure was gone, but I wasn't alone anymore. I looked down at my hand, and there, pressed into my skin, was an imprint. His face, twisted and contorted, forever burned into my palm. The door to the outside was wide open. I didn't think twice. I ran out into the night, never looking back. I never went back to that apartment either. But sometimes I can feel the shadow, watching, the knock, the voice. It was just the beginning. It was supposed to be a simple trip, a weekend getaway with some friends. We rented a cabin in the middle of nowhere, far from the hustle and bustle of city life. There was a certain charm in the isolation. I was eager to disconnect and unwind. But that charm quickly faded when we made our first stop for gas. The gas station was the only building for miles. A dusty, dimly lit place with a single pump outside. The neon sign flickered above us, struggling to stay lit. The air felt thick, like the heat hadn't moved in hours. Inside, the store was cramped and musty. An old man behind the counter gave us a long stare as we walked in. "You folks headed to the cabin up the way?" he asked, his voice rough as if he hadn't spoken in days. "Yeah, just on our way," I replied, feeling uneasy. There was something about the way he looked at us, like he already knew where we were going. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from beneath the counter, a small, weathered map. He slid it across to me. "The road. Ahead's not safe after dark. Take the long route?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. "The shortcuts. Not right." My friends laughed it off, assuming it was just some local superstition. But I couldn't shake the feeling in my stomach. We paid and left, continuing down the road toward our cabin. The deeper we drove into the woods, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees pressed in on us like walls, blocking out the fading sunlight. The further we went, the more the air felt heavy, damp with something wrong. By the time we reached the cabin, it was nearly pitch black. The place was beautiful, tucked away at the edge of a small lake, but there was an eerie stillness to it, like the world outside didn't exist. We unpacked quickly and lit a fire in the fireplace, but as the hours passed, a strange feeling settled over me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the house felt like it was watching us. Around midnight, we heard something from the woods, a low rustling, like something large moving through the brush. It was too loud to be an animal. My friend Rachel joked that it was probably just a bear, but her voice wavered, betraying her nerves. We all laughed nervously, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Then, a loud bang against the cabin door made us all freeze. "Who's out there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, but the door shook again. Rachel was the first to act. She grabbed a flashlight and we all followed, her to the door, hearts pounding. Slowly, she opened it. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the blackness of the woods. "Nothing," Rachel said, her voice a little too loud in the silence. She stepped outside. "Rachel, don't." I tried to stop her, but it was too late. She screamed. We rushed out after her, but by the time we reached the edge of the porch, she was gone. The woods swallowed her whole, and all we heard was the eerie wind rustling through the trees. Panic set in. We called her name, but no response came. Then I noticed something strange in the distance, a flickering light moving slowly through the trees. It was a lantern. It was swinging, but there was no one holding it. Something made me step forward. I don't know why. Maybe I hoped it was Rachel trying to find her way back. But as I walked closer to the light, my friends shouted for me to stop. The lantern swung wildly, moving faster now, and I could hear it. The soft, steady thudding of something large, something heavy, moving in the dark. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the light. Then I saw them. Figures in the trees, moving with unnatural speed. They were tall, too tall, with long arms that reached out toward me, their faces obscured by shadows. But their eyes, pale, wide, glowing, were locked on me, and I felt my blood freeze. I turned and ran back to the cabin, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut in my face. My friends were inside, shouting for me to get in, but when I looked back at the woods, the lantern was gone. The figures were too. But that wasn't the worst part. It was Rachel's voice. It was coming from the woods. "Help me," she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. "Please, come back." I tried to speak, tried to scream, but the words caught in my throat. My friends were already unlocking the door, but when I stepped inside, something was different. The air was colder, heavier. The cabin felt wrong. And then I saw it. On the wall, next to the fireplace, carved into the wood with deep gouges, was a message. "They wait for the last one." The lights flickered and went out. All that was left was the lantern light, now, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I looked toward the window and saw it. Rachel, standing in the woods, staring at me, her eyes empty and hollow, the lantern swinging from her hand. The door slammed shut again. We were trapped, and it was waiting for us all. It was supposed to be a casual evening hike. My cousin and I had done this trail dozens of times before. It snaked through the hills above the town, offering stunning views of the sunset and just enough challenge to make you feel accomplished. That evening, we set out later than usual, hoping to catch the stars once the sun dipped below the horizon. We didn't think twice when we passed the old sign at the trailhead. It was rusted and illegible, but we knew the path by heart. The air was cool and still, and the only sounds were our boots crunching on the dirt and the distant chirping of crickets. As the sun set, the trees cast long shadows over the trail, making everything feel a little smaller, a little closer. About halfway up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. The sun was a fiery orange, sinking slowly into the horizon. But as the last rays of light faded, we noticed something strange. There was no moon, not even a sliver. The sky was darker than we had ever seen it, like a heavy curtain had been pulled across the stars. The first uneasy feeling crept in then, but neither of us said anything. We turned on our flashlights and kept walking. That's when we heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the bushes ahead. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make us stop. We scanned the area with our flashlights. The beam landed on nothing but branches and leaves. My cousin shrugged it off, muttering something about deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The rustling continued, faint and deliberate, always staying just ahead of us on the trail. We kept walking, faster now, the rhythm of our footsteps breaking the silence. The trail felt different somehow, narrower. The trees seemed taller, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky like bony fingers. I tried to tell myself it was just the darkness playing tricks on me, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. The rustling stopped. We froze, listening. The night had gone completely silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. My flashlight flickered and my stomach dropped. I smacked it against my palm and the light steadied, but that moment of darkness was enough to make my heart race. Then we heard it, a voice, low and breathy, coming from the trees. Help. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. My cousin and I looked at each other, eyes wide. The voice came again, louder this time. It sounded close, too close. Help me. It didn't sound right. The tone was off, hollow, and strained, like someone trying to mimic a human voice but not quite getting it right. Against my better judgment, I called out, asking if someone was there. No response. Then we saw it. A figure stepped onto the trail ahead of us. It was shrouded in shadow, its shape impossible to define. My cousin aimed his flashlight at it, and I felt my blood run cold. The figure didn't have a face. It was smooth and featureless like a mannequin, but it moved like a living thing, jerking slightly as if adjusting to the light. We stood frozen, too scared to run, too scared to move. The figure raised a hand, pointing down the trail. Its arm was too long, the joints bending at unnatural angles. It tilted its head, and for a moment I thought I heard it breathe. Then it turned and walked into the woods, disappearing into the trees without a sound. The moment it was gone, the forest came alive again. The crickets chirped, the wind rustled the leaves, and it was as if nothing had happened. Without a word, my cousin and I turned and bolted back down the trail, running, as fast as our legs could carry us. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in on us from all sides. When we finally reached the car, we slammed the doors shut and peeled out of the parking lot, not stopping until we were back in town. We never spoke about it after that night. I don't know what we saw, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear that voice. It wasn't asking for help. It was calling us in. When I was a kid, my family lived on a small farm at the edge of a sprawling cornfield. It wasn't the idyllic countryside you'd see in paintings. Our house was old and creaky, and the cornfield seemed endless, especially at night. It was the kind of place where silence felt like a living thing, pressing in on you when the wind wasn't blowing. One summer evening, my parents went into town for supplies, leaving me and my older brother in charge of the place. The sun had just set, leaving streaks of orange and purple on the horizon. We were supposed to feed the animals and lock up the barn, but instead, we decided to play hide-and-seek in the cornfield. The rules were simple. Stay within the first 10 rows and don't go too far from the house. My brother, always the braver one, volunteered to hide first. He darted into the tall stalks of corn while I counted to 50. The corn rustled as he moved, the sound growing fainter as he pushed deeper into the field. When I finished counting, I called out for him, stepping into the rows with a mix of excitement and unease. The corn loomed high above me, blocking out the moonlight. Every step felt louder than it should have, the dry leaves brushing against my arms and legs. "Come out," I called, trying to sound confident. No answer, just the soft whisper of the wind moving through the corn. I laughed nervously, convinced he was trying to scare me. I pushed forward, parting the stalks, my heart thumping a little harder with every step. Then I heard it, a soft, shuffling sound ahead of me, like footsteps, dragging through the dirt. I froze, listening. "Gotcha!" I yelled, sprinting toward the noise. But when I burst through the stalks, I stopped cold. It wasn't my brother. There was someone standing there, just a few rows ahead of me, their back turned. They were tall and unnaturally thin, with arms hanging too long by their sides. "Jason," I whispered, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move. My heart pounded as I backed away, trying to retrace my steps. But as I turned, I realized I was lost. The rows of corn looked the same in every direction, and the farmhouse was nowhere in sight. I called out for my brother again, panic rising in my chest. That's when I heard the laughter. It wasn't loud, it was faint and distant, like it was being carried on the wind. But it wasn't Jason's laugh. It sounded hollow, like it was coming from a throat that didn't quite know how to laugh. The rustling started again, this time from all around me. I spun in circles, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was everywhere. My breathing grew shallow as I stumbled through the rows, the stalks closing in tighter. Then I saw it again, the figure. But this time, it was closer. Its head tilted unnaturally, as if it was trying to see me without turning all the way around. The laughter came again, louder now, and I bolted, pushing through the corn as fast as I could. The stalks scratched at my arms and face, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. I burst into the clearing near the house, panting and covered in dirt. Jason was standing by the barn, holding a flashlight, his face pale. "Where were you?" he yelled, his voice trembling. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but he cut me off. "We need to go inside. Now." That's when I noticed it. His hands were shaking, and his flashlight beam kept darting to the edge of the cornfield. I turned to look and felt my stomach drop. The figure was standing at the edge of the field, half hidden in the shadows. Its face was still obscured, but I could see its arms, long, spindly things that hung down past its knees. It stepped forward, its movements jerky, almost insect-like. We ran inside, slamming the door and locking it. Jason pulled the curtains shut, but I couldn't stop myself from peeking out. The figure was gone, but the cornfield seemed alive, swaying as if something was moving through it. We didn't sleep that night. When my parents came home the next morning, we told them what had happened. They didn't believe us, of course, but they didn't have to. That afternoon, we found footprints in the dirt outside the barn. They were huge, far too big to belong to any human, and leading from the footprints were drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled back into the cornfield. We never played hide-and-seek again. It was a quiet, ordinary evening when we decided to explore the old tunnel beneath the city. The tunnel wasn't exactly hidden, but it wasn't well known either, just a place some kids had talked about exploring years ago. My friends and I, curious and bored, thought it might make for an interesting adventure. None of us expected what we would find. The entrance was hidden under a narrow bridge, overgrown with weeds, covered in graffiti. It smelled of damp earth and decay. As we walked down, flashlights cutting through the darkness, the air grew colder and the walls seemed to press in around us. The tunnel stretched ahead, endless, lit only by the faint glow of our headlights. First, everything felt normal. The tunnel echoed with the sound of our footsteps and the strange whispers of the wind. But the deeper we went, the more the feeling of unease settled over us. My friends joked, trying to lighten the mood, but I could tell we were all on edge. There was something oppressive about the tunnel, as if it had been waiting for us. Then we heard it. Faint, distant at first, like a whisper. "Help! Help!" We exchanged uneasy glances. The voice wasn't loud enough to make sense of, but it seemed to resonate through the tunnel like a ghostly echo. I knew then that we were no longer alone. One of my friends, Sam, called out hesitantly. "Hello? Is someone down there?" The response came again, louder this time. "Help! Help! Please!" This time it was clearer, as if someone was begging us from the darkness. We hesitated, unsure whether to respond or run, but something about the desperation in that voice kept us rooted in place. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was worse than any response. We listened to the sound of our own breathing, the faint drip of water from the ceiling. Then, another sound, soft, dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. "Please. Help!" "I'm trapped," the voice called again, but this time it was closer. We didn't move. The flashlight beams swept the shadows, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing to be seen. The tunnel stretched endlessly, the darkness swallowing the light. Suddenly, something shifted. A figure emerged from the blackness. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The shape was twisted, elongated, its limbs jerking unnaturally as it moved toward us. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, empty and hollow, like voids in the darkness. "Help!" the figure rasped, its voice distorted, as though speaking from a place far beyond our world. We backed away, panic surging through us. The tunnel seemed to stretch further, the walls closing in around us. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human, and it wasn't something we could fight. Without thinking, we turned and ran. The tunnel echoed with our footsteps, the strange cries of the figure fading behind us. I didn't stop until we burst out into the cold night air, gasping and trembling. None of us looked back. To this day, I don't know what we saw. The tunnel remains beneath the city, hidden, waiting. I've tried to convince myself it was a dream, a trick of the light, but I know better. Something is down there, something that shouldn't be disturbed. I still hear the voice sometimes, calling from the dark, and I know I'll never forget it. It was a late autumn evening when my friends and I decided to take a spontaneous trip to an old, abandoned lighthouse on the edge of the coast. None of us had ever been there, and the place had always been rumored to be haunted. Skeptical, as we all were, we figured it would make for an eerie, atmospheric adventure. The lighthouse stood tall against the backdrop of a dark, churning sea. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of an old wooden pier as we parked the car a few miles down the narrow, winding road. The air was heavy with mist and the salty tang of the ocean. We all felt the shift in the atmosphere as we stepped out of the car, the warmth of the day fading fast. As we approached the base of the lighthouse, the shadows seemed to stretch longer, as if the darkness itself was watching us. The structure loomed in front of us, its once pristine white paint now weathered and peeling. The steps spiraled upwards into the sky, vanishing into the dense fog that had rolled in. "We'll split up," Matt said, his voice breaking the silence. "That way, we cover more ground. One of us can check out the bottom while the rest go up." Against my better judgment, we agreed. I could feel the weight of the ancient stone beneath my feet as I started climbing, the sounds of my friend's footsteps fading below. Each creaking step seemed louder than the last, the wind growing stronger as I ascended. The higher I climbed, the colder the air became. I paused, turning back to glance at the fog that now swallowed the ground below. My heart pounded in my chest. It was so quiet, except for the sound of my own breath and the faint echo of the wind. When I finally reached the top, I pushed open the rusted door, stepping into the narrow space of the lighthouse. The view from the top was breathtaking. Mist rolling in every direction, the sea stretching out beyond the horizon, waves crashing against the rocks below. But something wasn't right. The air felt thick, as if it had a weight of its own. The sound of the wind was different now, more oppressive, as if it carried something more than just the chill of the ocean. I turned to scan the interior of the lighthouse, its walls lined with faded photographs of sailors and their families, some so old they were barely recognizable. That's when I saw it. The figure. It was standing by the window, its shape barely distinguishable from the fog. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw its outline, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared right through me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My body felt frozen as the figure turned, slightly, facing me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, like a ghostly silhouette against the window. The wind howled louder, and I could feel the cold seeping through my jacket. My legs trembled as I slowly backed away, my hand gripping the cold metal railing. Suddenly, I heard voices below. "Guys, where are you?" It was Matt, his voice frantic. "Come on, we need to get out of here." "Matt," I yelled, panic rising in my throat. "There's something. Up here." Before I could react, the figure began to move, floating towards me with unnatural grace. My breath hitched as I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the narrow stairs. I could feel the presence closing in, the figure growing larger with every step I took down. When I finally reached the bottom, my friends were waiting, eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I saw it," I managed to say, breathless. "It was up there, watching me." The rest of the night passed in silence. We didn't speak much as we packed up and left the lighthouse behind. The figure, whatever it was, haunted my thoughts, its hollow gaze etched in my mind. I still don't know what I saw that night, but sometimes, on quiet evenings, I find myself staring out into the fog, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching from the distance. It was the middle of summer, and my friends and I decided to take a day trip to a remote beach, far from the usual tourist spots. We wanted to escape the crowds and find some quiet, peaceful place to relax. The beach wasn't well known, tucked away down a narrow, winding road, hidden from the rest of the world. We arrived in the early afternoon, greeted by nothing but the endless stretch of sand and the gentle lapping of waves. The sky was clear, the sun blazing overhead. The beach, stretched out before us, empty except for a few distant figures far off in the distance. It was perfect. We set up our towels, spread out some chairs, and spent the day swimming, talking, and soaking up the sun. The water was warm, the air salty and fresh. It felt like paradise, away from the noise and rush of everyday life. But as the sun began to dip closer to the horizon, something started to feel off. The air seemed to grow heavier, and a strange quiet had settled over the beach. Even the waves seemed quieter, like they were retreating, leaving behind an eerie stillness. My friends didn't seem to notice, too lost in their own conversations, but I felt a prickling on the back of my neck, an instinctive warning that something wasn't right. I wandered a little closer to the water, scanning the horizon. That's when I saw them. Two figures standing at the edge of the ocean, staring out at nothing. They weren't moving, weren't even talking, just standing there as if they were waiting for something. I didn't want to believe it, but as I moved closer, I could see their faces. They weren't like us. Their eyes were hollow, dark, and empty. There was something wrong with their skin, too. Pale, almost translucent, as though they didn't belong in the sunlight. They turned slightly, as if sensing my gaze, but didn't. Look at me. Their attention remained fixed on the horizon. I felt a wave of panic rising, my breath quickening. I turned and ran back to my friends, my heart thudding in my chest. "We need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. "Now!" They laughed it off, thinking I was overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling of those figures standing there, their eyes lifeless, their faces twisted in a way I couldn't understand. As we packed up our things and started heading back, the silence followed us. The beach was still empty, the distant figures still watching us, their presence growing more and more oppressive. I glanced back one last time, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. The figures weren't there anymore, but I could still feel their gaze on me. It was late October, the sky heavy with overcast clouds as we set off for a camping trip. My friends and I had been planning this trip for months, far away from the city, deep into the heart of a forest we'd never visited before. None of us had ever camped out this far from civilization, but the promise of quiet, untouched wilderness was too tempting. We arrived at the site in the late afternoon, the air crisp and carrying the earthy scent of fallen leaves. The campground was abandoned with no signs of other campers. The silence stretched out around us, broken only by the distant rustling of trees and the soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet. As we unpacked and set up our tents, the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees. By the time night fell, we had a small fire going, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the ground. The forest stretched out before us, dark and vast, and the only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the distant hoot of an owl. We sat around the fire, sharing stories, laughing, and drinking. The tension from the city life seemed to melt away as we relaxed under the canopy of stars. But even in the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The forest seemed too still, too quiet. It wasn't just peaceful, it was eerily quiet. Around midnight, I decided to check the area beyond our campsite. Something about the woods felt off, as though they were holding their breath. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured a little further into the trees. The ground was soft and uneven beneath my feet, and the only light came from my flashlight's dim beam. I walked for what felt like hours, the trees towering above me, their branches twisting into the darkness. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling that I was being watched. My heartbeat quickened and I stopped, shining the light around. There was nothing but trees, shadows, and the faint creak of the wind. But then I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible figure in the distance. It wasn't human. It was tall and slender, standing motionless. My breath hitched, and I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off it. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, unmoving. I turned and ran back to camp, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. When I returned, my friends were asleep, blissfully unaware of the presence I had felt. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the memory of that figure stayed with me. The next morning, we packed up quickly and decided to head back to civilization. None of us spoke about what I had seen. I was too afraid they wouldn't believe me. As we walked back, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again, but the forest was silent, as though it had never been disturbed. Even now, years later, I wonder what it was I saw that night. Whatever it was, I know I wasn't alone in the forest. I was on a road trip, solo, something I'd always wanted to do. Just me, my car, and the open road stretching ahead. I decided to take a scenic route, away from the highways, weaving through small, forgotten towns. The goal was simple: get lost in the quiet and enjoy the freedom of being alone. By the time the sun started to set, I was deep in unfamiliar territory. The winding road was flanked by endless fields of tall grass that seemed to stretch forever. There was nothing around, just miles of isolation and silence. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool air fill the car, the only sounds being the soft hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of crickets. As the light faded, I found myself searching for a place to stop for the night. There was no sign of a town or motel for miles, just endless fields and a single, overgrown dirt path leading off to the side of the road. It wasn't much of a choice, but I decided to follow the path, hoping to find a clearing to park and rest. The path led me to a small, abandoned barn surrounded by broken-down fences. It wasn't much, but it offered shelter. The place felt like it hadn't been touched in years, with weeds growing thick through the cracks in the wood. I parked near the entrance, killed the engine, and sat in the silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the trees. It wasn't long before I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought maybe it was just an animal, but the feeling of being watched was too distinct. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the sensation didn't fade. I decided to explore the barn, curious about what might be inside. The door creaked open, revealing a musty, dark interior. I stepped cautiously, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of decay lingered. What was once used to store hay and farm tools had become a hollow shell of rotting wood and forgotten belongings. I moved further into the barn, shining my flashlight around the dusty space. Old furniture covered in layers of grime, rusted tools scattered on the floor. There was nothing of interest, just reminders of what the place once was. I felt my unease growing, but my curiosity kept me going. That's when I saw it. A figure standing in the far corner of the barn, barely visible in the dim light. My breath hitched as I froze, unable to look away. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there in the shadows, watching. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to step closer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I didn't want to believe what I was seeing, but there it was. A human-shaped silhouette standing still as if trapped in the dark. "Who's there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. I took another step, and then another, my legs feeling heavy. With each movement, the figure seemed to draw closer, though it didn't advance itself. It was like we were inching toward each other slowly, relentlessly. When I was just a few feet away, I saw it. The face. Or what I thought was a face. Hollow, sunken eyes stared back at me, void of any life or expression. The features were distorted, almost alien. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The barn creaked again, and then, without warning, the figure took a step forward. I stumbled backward, tripping over some debris and falling to the ground. My heart pounded as I scrambled to my feet, trying to escape, but the figure moved faster than I could comprehend. I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. I could hear the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. My legs felt like they were on fire as I burst through the barn door, gasping for air. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my fingers shaking uncontrollably. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, the figure far behind, lost in the darkness. I still don't know what I saw that night. Whatever it wasn't human. It wasn't supposed to be there. But I do know this: I'll never take another solo road trip into the unknown. The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. It was a cool, quiet evening, and I decided to take a walk through the old, deserted forest near my apartment. The trees there have always been tall and ominous, their branches tangled like they were reaching out toward something beyond. I had always felt a strange sense of peace walking through the woods, but that evening was different. It was getting late, and the sky had grown dark, casting everything in a heavy, oppressive silence. I walked further than I usually did, deeper into the forest, the sound of my boots crunching against the fallen leaves the only noise accompanying me. Then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, like someone calling my name. I stopped, scanning the trees, but there was no one there. My breath hitched, and I told myself it was just the wind. Still, I felt uneasy. The whisper repeated, growing louder, almost as if it was coming from inside my head. I turned around, heart thudding in my chest. The forest behind me stretched out, dark and still, but there was something off about it. The trees seemed to loom closer, their shadows twisting and shifting in ways they shouldn't have. I hurried back, my legs trembling, but the whisper followed me, always just out of reach. When I got home, I didn't mention it to anyone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, some trick of the mind after spending too much time in the quiet. A week passed and I forgot about the whispers, until the second night. This time, I wasn't walking through the forest. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard it again. Fainter at first, but growing louder. The whispering came from the corner of my room. It was almost like a voice now, but distorted, like it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The whispering didn't stop. It was closer now, right by my ear. "Come with me," it said, and the words sent shivers down my spine. I stayed frozen, my eyes wide open, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispering didn't fade away. Instead, it seemed to grow louder, more urgent. "You belong with us," it murmured. I covered my ears, but the sound was still there, filling my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The next morning, I woke up exhausted, as though I hadn't slept at all. My head throbbed and I felt a strange emptiness that wouldn't go away. Still, I didn't tell anyone. What could I say? That I had heard voices? No one would believe me. Days passed, and everything felt different. The whispering never stopped, though I tried to ignore it. It was always there, when I was alone, when I was in public. It followed me like a shadow, growing louder, more distinct. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to confront it. I went back to the forest, driven by a need to understand what was happening. As I walked deeper into the trees, the whispering grew louder, until it was almost a scream. Then, in the dead silence of the woods, I saw them. Shapes. Dark figures, standing just beyond the reach of the trees. They didn't move, didn't speak. They were shadows, but somehow, they felt real. The whispering became clearer. "You hear us now," one said. Its voice wasn't human. It was more like a collective, a chorus of countless voices. Terror gripped me, but I couldn't look away. The figures stretched toward me, their features twisted and distorted as though they had no faces, no identity, just voids of endless blackness. "I don't belong here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figures tilted their heads, a soft, eerie sound echoing through the forest. "But you do." I turned to run, but the figures followed as though they were part of the very shadows themselves. The whispering filled my ears, growing louder, until I could hear nothing else. I could feel them closing in, their presence suffocating. I woke up the next morning, lying on the ground, covered in dirt and leaves. The forest was silent again, as though nothing had happened. I was alive, but something had changed. Something inside me had shifted. The whispers have never stopped. They still come to me in the quiet, always closer, always more persistent. And now, I know they'll never let me go. It was supposed to be a simple day, just a quiet walk through the neighborhood. I lived in a suburban area, nothing unusual about it. I liked to take long walks after work to clear my head, the kind of walks where you don't think much about anything, just put one foot in front of the other, lost in your own thoughts. But that day, something felt off from the very beginning. The sky was overcast, casting a dull gray light over everything. The streets were empty, no kids playing, no cars passing by. It was eerily quiet, but I figured everyone must have been inside, waiting out the weather. I didn't think much of it, just kept walking, letting my mind wander. It wasn't until I passed the old abandoned house at the end of the street that the feeling of unease really sank in. The house had been empty for as long as I could remember. Worn-down shutters, a porch that creaked with every gust of wind. I always avoided it, always felt like something wasn't right about it. But this time, something about the atmosphere pulled me closer. I slowed my pace, staring at the house. It looked different, almost as if it had been watching me. The windows, once dark and empty, now seemed to gleam with an unsettling intensity. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw movement inside. I shook my head and told myself I was imagining things. As I took another step forward, I heard a sound, a soft whisper, too low to make out. My skin crawled. I stopped, trying to listen, but the world around me seemed unnaturally silent, almost as though the sound had been swallowed by the void. Then I saw it. A figure appeared in one of the upstairs windows, standing still. It was tall, obscured by the dim light, but there was something off about it. It wasn't a shadow. It felt more like a void, an absence of something rather than a presence. My breath caught as the figure tilted its head as if studying me. I should have turned and run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at it, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called that, seemed to peer directly into my soul. Seconds felt like hours. Then the figure turned and disappeared from the window. My legs felt like stone as I finally managed to take a step back, my mind screaming at me to leave. I stumbled away, never taking my eyes off the house. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, truly watched. The emptiness that had once filled the neighborhood now felt suffocating, like the world had become a void of silence and shadows. When I got home, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. The thought of that figure still haunted me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. Something was there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going to forget me. It started as an ordinary evening. I was driving home after spending the day clearing out my grandmother's old attic. The house had been untouched for decades, filled with boxes of forgotten memories. It had been a long, dusty day, and now I was finally heading back. The sun had set hours ago, and the country roads were quiet, stretching endlessly into the darkness. The radio had been static for the past few miles. I didn't mind. The road ahead was barely lit by the faint glow of my headlights, casting long shadows that danced across the trees lining the sides of the road. It was peaceful, except for the growing unease that had been settling in my chest since I left the house. About halfway home, the road curved sharply, and ahead, I noticed something unusual. A figure stood at the edge of the road. I slowed the car, my stomach tightening. It was a woman, I could tell even from a distance. She wore a long, flowing dress that billowed slightly in the wind. She was staring directly at my car, unmoving. I slowed to a crawl, unsure what to do. As I passed her, my heart pounded harder. I glanced at her through the rear-view mirror. She was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. I didn't know why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few minutes later, I heard it. A faint knocking sound, soft but persistent. It came from the back of my car, barely loud enough to hear over the hum of the engine. I slowed even further, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I kept glancing into the mirror but saw nothing but the empty stretch of road behind me. The knocking continued, growing louder now, more urgent. I didn't dare stop. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination? Some kind of mechanical noise? But it didn't sound mechanical. It was too deliberate. And then, just as I was about to pull over, the knocking stopped. For a long stretch, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels oppressive, as if the world itself is holding its breath. I gripped the wheel tighter, eyes glued to the road ahead, waiting for something. Anything. It wasn't until I neared the edge of town that I saw her again. The woman from before, standing by the side of the road. This time, she was closer, and in the moonlight I could see her face. Her eyes were hollow, black holes staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized she wasn't just standing there. She was walking. But it wasn't the slow, deliberate steps of a living person. It was as if she was drifting, gliding with unnatural ease. I tried to tell myself it was just some wandering spirit, a hallucination maybe. But the fear clawing at my chest was real. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel tighter. As I passed her, I braced myself for the sound of her voice, but it never came. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I finally reached my house, I was shaking. I locked the door behind me and didn't bother looking back. I didn't go out the next night, or the one after that. And I've never seen that woman again. But some nights, I swear I can still hear the faint sound of knocking. It was supposed to be just a quiet day in the park, like any other. My friends and I decided to visit a local nature reserve, one we had gone to several times before. The plan was simple. Take a leisurely stroll through the trails, enjoy the quiet, and maybe spot some wildlife. The reserve was vast, sprawling with dense forests, winding paths, and open meadows. The air was fresh, and apart from the chirping of birds, there wasn't a sound. We had been walking for hours, soaking in the peace, taking turns spotting birds and tracking animal prints. Everything felt normal. Too normal. It was around mid-afternoon when something changed. We took a break by clearing near a small, overgrown pond. My friend Emma bent down to dip her hand into the water, running her fingers through the surface. As she did, there was a faint ripple, and she froze. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. We all gathered around, following her gaze. The pond looked calm, but there was something strange about it, like the reflection wasn't quite right. The surface of the water didn't ripple naturally. It shifted in unnatural ways, as if there was something beneath the surface, watching us. I had seen enough horror movies to know that something wasn't right, but I tried to push those thoughts away. "Maybe it's just the wind," I suggested, though my voice trembled. Emma shook her head. "No, that wasn't wind. It was like something moved under the water." We exchanged glances, unsure what to make of it. The park had always been peaceful. There was no history of accidents, no reports of strange occurrences. Still, that feeling of unease lingered. We decided to leave the clearing and continue down the trail, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. But as we walked further, something felt off. The trees seemed to close in around us, their shadows darker than they should have been. The birdsong had stopped entirely, and there was an eerie silence hanging over the forest. We reached a fork in the path, unsure which way to go. The map we had brought was missing, and no one remembered where we had left it. We stood there for what felt like hours, the tension growing with each passing second. It was Emma who noticed it first. Footprints. They were small, barely noticeable in the dirt, but they looked fresh. They didn't belong to any of us. "Someone's been here," she said, her voice trembling. I crouched down, inspecting the prints. They weren't human. They were long, claw-like marks, digging deep into the earth. My stomach twisted as I traced the prints, feeling their unnatural depth. "I don't like this," I muttered. "We should turn back." But none of us could bring ourselves to move. We were frozen in place, staring at the trail that seemed to go on forever. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like something breathing, just beyond the trees. It was soft at first, almost indistinct, but it grew louder, more insistent. My ears strained, trying to make sense of the sound, but it wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was closer now, too close. "Run," Emma whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the trail, sprinting through the thick forest, our hearts pounding in our chests. The trees blurred as we moved, but no matter how fast we ran, the sound seemed to be right behind us, never fading. We came to a clearing, and that's when we saw it. It wasn't an animal or a person. It was something else entirely. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing in the middle of the path. Its skin was stretched tight over bone, its eyes hollow and empty. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on us, unrelenting. "We have to go," I yelled, pulling my friends along. We didn't stop running until we broke through the trees and reached the edge of the park, gasping for breath. When we looked back, there was nothing there. No footprints, no figure, only the trees swaying in the wind. To this day, we have no explanation for what we saw. The reserve was quiet once more, but something had changed. Whatever we encountered in those woods was still out there, lurking in the shadows. We've never returned to that place. I never believed in curses. At least, not until that day at the old vineyard. It was a hot summer afternoon, the kind where the sun feels too close and everything feels quiet. My friends and I decided to visit the vineyard just outside town, a place that had always been talked about in hushed whispers. The old stories said the vineyard was abandoned after a family tragedy, that something had happened there long ago, a fire, a disappearance, or something worse. We drove up the cracked gravel road, surrounded by nothing but vines stretching endlessly into the horizon. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, but we ignored it, eager for the adventure. We parked and wandered through the rows of withered grapevines, their leaves brittle and brown, like they hadn't seen care in decades. As we made our way deeper into the vineyard, A strange sense of unease began to creep in. The silence was absolute. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the heavy, oppressive quiet of the vines pressing in around us. We eventually stumbled upon an old barn, its roof partially caved in, vines crawling up the weathered walls. We ventured inside, careful not to disturb the cobwebs hanging from the rafters. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the only sound was the occasional creak of the old wood beneath our feet. It was there, in that musty barn, that we found the old trunk. It was rusted shut, sitting in the corner like it had been forgotten for decades. My friend, Mark, pushed at the lid, but it wouldn't budge. "Let's leave it," I said, but something about the trunk drew us in, like a magnet. Mark grabbed a crowbar from the corner and pried open the lid. Inside, we found faded photographs, yellowed letters, and an old diary. The diary had a name written in faded ink: Elena. We flipped through the pages, reading about her life on the vineyard, her family, her dreams, and the slow, tragic unraveling of their once thriving land. Elena had written about losing everything, of strange occurrences in the vineyard, and of a curse that had followed her family for generations. "I thought this was just a legend," Mark muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The more we read, the heavier the air seemed to become. It was like the barn itself was pushing down on us. Suddenly, a chill ran down my spine as I read something that stopped me cold. They say the vineyard takes what it wants, and what it wants is you. Before I could even process what I'd read, a sudden, sharp sound echoed through the barn, like something had snapped. We all turned, eyes wide, hearts pounding. The trunk slammed shut on its own, with a resounding crash that reverberated through the silence. Something was wrong. Something had changed. As we stepped outside, the vineyard felt different. The sun seemed to dim, and the once quiet air buzzed with a low, unnatural hum. I glanced back at the barn, but it was gone, replaced by a thick wall of vines that hadn't been there before. We ran. The vineyard stretched endlessly, but we didn't stop, feet pounding the dry dirt, hearts hammering in our chests. Every step felt like we were running through a dream. Everything around us twisted and distorted. That's when we heard it. Whispers. Voices on the wind, calling to us. Soft at first, then louder and more insistent. They weren't human voices. They were cold, hollow, and filled with a dark hunger. We didn't stop, even when the vines began to close in around us. We could feel something. Watching. Waiting. As if the land itself was alive. Breathing and yearning. When we finally broke free from the vineyard, the town was nowhere to be seen. The road that had brought us there had vanished. We wandered aimlessly, lost and terrified, the echoes of those whispers still lingering in our ears. To this day, we've never spoken of what happened that afternoon. The vineyard isn't talked about anymore, and the old town avoids it entirely. But I know one thing. There's something out there, something waiting, buried deep in the vines, and I'm not sure it's ever truly gone. It was a quiet summer evening when my friends and I decided to take a drive. We didn't have any particular destination in mind, just wanted to escape the noise of the city and soak in the stillness of the countryside. We left town with no real plan, winding down narrow back roads, passing the occasional farmhouse and letting the radio fill the silence. We ended up on an old, forgotten road, the kind with broken pavement and weeds pushing through cracks. It stretched on for miles, empty except for the occasional crows circling above. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the land in a dull orange glow. We pulled over at a random spot where the trees opened up, leaving a stretch of land that felt completely isolated. The silence was heavier now, the kind that creeps into your chest, making it harder to breathe. We got out of the car, stretched, and walked a few feet to sit on the hood, staring out at the horizon. It felt perfect, peaceful, distant, far from the chaos of everything. But as the minutes stretched on, a strange sense of tension began to creep in. My friend Jess was the first to break the silence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. We all fell quiet, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing, just the soft rustle of wind through the grass, but then, faintly, we heard it, a distant, echoing sound. A voice, perhaps, or something that barely resembled one. It was hard to tell. The sound came and went, almost like breathing, but slower, heavier. We exchanged uneasy glances, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was just the wind, or some far-off noise we couldn't identify. But it didn't sit right. There was something too deliberate about it, like it was aware of us. After a few minutes, the noise stopped. We relaxed a bit, laughed nervously, and chalked it up to our imagination. But as soon as we settled back into our thoughts, we heard it again. This time, it was closer, more distinct. A whisper, drawn out, almost as if someone, or something, was speaking, but we couldn't make out the words. "What the hell is that?" Jake asked, his voice trembling. We all leaned in, listening harder now. The sound was coming from the trees, just beyond the clearing, just beyond where we could see. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing down on us. "Let's get back to the car," I said, standing up. My voice was shaky. The fear I felt wasn't like any I'd ever experienced. It was primal, instinctual. But as we turned to walk back, we heard it again. Closer this time, and clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was laughter. A low, hollow laughter, chilling in its emptiness. It didn't sound like any human laugh. It wasn't playful. It was wrong. We didn't speak. We didn't dare. Our feet moved faster, scrambling back toward the car, the laughter following us, echoing through the trees. When we reached the vehicle, we slammed the doors shut and locked them. I could barely see through the windshield, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. The laughter didn't stop. It was all around us now, growing louder, closer. "I think we need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Just as I was about to start the engine, Jess screamed. I turned to see what she was pointing at, and there, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, gaunt, its eyes empty and hollow, watching us from the edge of the woods. We didn't hesitate. The car roared to life, tires kicking up dust as we sped down the empty road. The figure remained behind, standing motionless as we drove away. But I could still hear the laughter, trailing off into the distance. Even now, I wonder what was out there that night. I've tried to convince myself it was just some animal, something we couldn't understand. But the look in its eyes, empty and hollow, tells me otherwise. Whatever was there, whatever followed us, is still out there. I never really believed in curses or legends, at least not until that night. It was just an ordinary trip, something I had done 100 times before, driving late along the old highway that cuts through the dense forest. No one lives out there, just the trees and the empty stretch of road, fading into nothingness. That night, I was returning home from a late-night visit to a small town a few hours away. The drive itself was always uneventful, the kind of road that stretches endlessly with only the soft hum of the tires and the headlights cutting through the darkness. Around midnight, I noticed something strange. In the distance, there was a flicker of light in the forest. It wasn't coming from any vehicle. There were no other cars on the road for miles. The light flickered again, and this time I saw it, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. I slowed down, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't a person exactly, but something shaped like one. Tall and thin, with limbs that stretched unnaturally, bending as it moved. Its face was barely visible, but I could make out hollow, dark eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness directly at me. Panic surged through my chest, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move like a human, more like something inhuman, unnatural. It stayed there, watching me, unmoving, as if waiting. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and sped up, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees whipped past me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping pace with me, just beyond my vision, its presence looming closer with every passing second. When I glanced back in my rearview mirror, there was nothing. Just the endless stretch of road and the trees rushing past. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching. Eventually, the forest thinned and the road straightened. I glanced at the clock, nearly 3 a.m. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel tighter. The figure had vanished, but something in the air still felt heavy. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, my mind consumed by the image of those dark, hollow eyes. When I finally reached my driveway and stepped out of my car, the woods beyond seemed quieter than ever, as if they had been holding their breath the entire night. I still don't know what I saw, and I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when the night is too quiet and the trees outside my window seem to stretch too far, I wonder if that figure is still out there, waiting. It started with a simple evening trip. Just me and my partner, leaving the city behind for a quiet night under the stars. We had packed a cooler, a few blankets, and our hiking gear. The plan was to find a secluded spot, away from the noise, to enjoy the night sky. We drove out of town, into the rolling hills, the familiar sights of the city fading behind us. The roads became narrower, winding through forests, the trees towering overhead, blocking out the last of the fading light. By the time we reached a clearing by a small lake, the sun had vanished, leaving us in complete darkness. The spot was perfect. No light pollution, just the stillness of nature. We set up our tent near the water's edge, ate some snacks, and stretched out on our blankets, gazing at the sky. It was peaceful, serene. For a while, we didn't say much, just soaking in the quiet. Around midnight, we decided to take a walk along the shore. The lake was calm, almost like a mirror reflecting the stars above. I felt a sense of tranquility, the kind you only get when you're far from everything. But as we walked, something felt off. The night seemed to stretch out longer than it should have. We could hear nothing, no animals, no rustling leaves, not even the usual sounds of insects. It was too quiet. We stopped, staring out at the lake. The water was black as ink, undisturbed. That's when I noticed it, a figure. It was standing by the water, its shape indistinct against the dark. I called out to my partner, but the words caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't make out any details, but the feeling of wrongness was overwhelming. "Who's there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. It stayed perfectly still, just watching. The silence stretched, unbearable now. I wanted to look away, to turn back to the tent, but my feet wouldn't move. My partner, sensing my unease, grabbed my hand and pulled me, whispering, "Let's go." We hurried back to the tent, but as we reached it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was nothing. The lake and the woods were still and lifeless. We tried to convince ourselves it was just our imagination. Maybe it was a deer or some reflection playing tricks on us. We locked ourselves in the tent and lay there, my heart racing. At some point, I dozed off, but I woke suddenly. It wasn't the sound of footsteps that stirred me. It was the sense of someone watching. I peeked out of the tent, heart pounding, and saw the figure again just a few feet away from the tent. It was closer now, still motionless, still watching. I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Then, without warning, the figure turned and walked into the darkness, fading into the trees. The silence was deafening again except for the sound of my breath, shallow and trembling. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, everything was gone. No figure, no eerie presence. Just the quiet lake, the trees, and the silence. We packed up quickly, leaving before the sun rose. I haven't been back to that spot since. I don't know what we saw, but I know one thing for sure. The woods are still out there, waiting. I've always loved hiking and spending time in nature. It was one of those things that grounded me, being out in the woods, away from the noise of the world. A few weeks ago, my friends and I decided to explore a trail we hadn't been on before. It wasn't too far from town, but far enough that we figured we'd have it to ourselves. The day was perfect. Clear skies, the sun warming our backs as we hiked deeper into the woods. We made our way to a secluded clearing, nestled between towering trees. It was peaceful. Birds chirped, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of pine. We set up camp near a stream, took off our backpacks, and stretched out, content to take in the beauty of the forest. As the sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the trees, we gathered around the fire we'd built. The crackling sound of the flames was soothing, and we all felt at ease, joking and sharing stories. I didn't realize how dark it had become until one of my friends pointed up at the sky. "It's almost pitch black," she said, squinting upward. We all looked at each other, the laughter fading into a heavy silence. None of us had expected how fast the night would fall. The forest seemed to absorb the fading light, leaving us in complete darkness, save for the fire. Then, something shifted. I wasn't sure if it was the stillness of the forest or the creeping sensation in the pit of my stomach, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. I didn't want to alarm my friends, so I brushed it off, telling myself it was probably just the wind rustling the leaves or my imagination playing tricks. But then I heard it. A faint, unnatural noise coming from deeper in the woods. It wasn't a creature or an animal. It was something wrong. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the source of the noise. The beam cut through the trees, but there was nothing there, just more blackness. My friends noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy, but my voice came out shaky as I answered. "There's something out there." One of my friends scoffed. "It's probably just a deer or something." I wanted to believe that, but it didn't feel like an animal. The noise grew louder, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was distant at first, then closer. Each tap echoed through the trees, growing louder and more persistent. "I think we should head back," I said, my voice trembling. "Back where?" one of my friends asked. "The trail's too far. We'd be walking in the dark." But something about the forest felt off, like the trees themselves were watching us. The tapping continued, closer now, like something was moving through the underbrush. Then, the silence shattered. A figure emerged from the trees, moving in a way that wasn't human. Its form was elongated, almost unnatural, and it moved without making a sound. I could barely process what I was seeing, my heart racing as I fumbled with my flashlight. The beam hit it, and that's when I saw its face. No eyes, no mouth, just a hollow black void where a face should have been. It stood there, unmoving, watching us. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The thing didn't approach us, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there, watching. One of my friends whispered, "What is that?" "I have no idea," I managed to choke out. We sat frozen, staring at the figure until the tapping started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the direction of the figure. It was coming from behind us, from the clearing where we had our camp. We spun around, shining our flashlights. There was nothing there, just the fire, flickering dimly. But the tapping grew louder, now on both sides of us. Panic set in. We grabbed our things and ran, not looking back, not stopping, until we reached the trail. The figure never followed us, but the sounds didn't stop. They still echo in my mind. Even now, as I sit here writing this, I keep wondering, what was that thing? And why didn't it come after us? I've always loved spending my weekends exploring nature, far from the city lights and noise. A few friends and I decided to go on a hiking trip into the mountains, remote trails, hidden caves, and the promise of peace. We left early on a Saturday, driving for hours into the wilderness, leaving behind cell service and any form of modern convenience. The trailhead was a quiet spot, surrounded by towering pines and the hum of insects buzzing in the heat. We set off, excited to lose ourselves in the trees and rocks. The trail was rough but rewarding, winding deeper into the forest as the day wore on. We didn't see a single person the entire time, just the distant sounds of birds and the crunch of leaves beneath our feet. We stopped to rest after a few hours, finding a small clearing by a bubbling stream. It was serene, perfect for a break. We filled our bottles with cold water and spread out our packs, eating snacks and laughing. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. After eating, we decided to explore further. The trail continued on, snaking around the mountain, but something felt off. The quiet was louder than before, almost oppressive. My friends joked about how strange the silence was, but I wasn't laughing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't until we were deep in the woods that we noticed the marks on the trees. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the bark, running high and low as if something large had passed through. I stopped, staring at them. My stomach churned. "Do you think a bear did this?" I asked, pointing. "No way," one of my friends replied, laughing. "Bears don't make marks like that. Look, these are way too high." I nodded, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The idea of a bear, or anything large, hadn't crossed my mind, but these marks were unnatural. We looked around, but the trees seemed lifeless, their silence stretching into an eerie stillness. We pressed on, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. By the time we reached the base of the mountain, the sun was low on the horizon. The shadows of the trees stretched long across the ground. We decided it was time to head back, but something wasn't right. It felt like we were walking in circles, the trail no longer familiar. When we stopped to check our maps, we realized it wasn't the trail that had shifted. It was us. We weren't lost exactly, but we were disoriented, unable to find the landmarks we remembered. The air felt thicker, as though the forest had swallowed everything familiar. We retraced our steps, but nothing looked the same. Every tree felt like a stranger. We finally decided to make camp. It wasn't ideal, but we needed to rest. As night fell, the forest became even more silent. It was a different kind of quiet, one that felt heavy, almost oppressive. The usual sounds of insects and wildlife had vanished, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I couldn't sleep. Something felt off. My friends drifted into restless slumber, but I stayed awake, watching the shadows shift around the fire. Every little noise made me jump. The snap of a twig, the whisper of wind through the trees. I knew something was watching us. I just couldn't explain how I knew. At some point, I heard it. A low, distorted whisper. Faint at first, but growing louder. It came from the trees, as if something was calling to us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper became clearer, more insistent. "Come. Closer." The voice was not human. It was hollow, distant, like it came from the shadows themselves. My pulse quickened as I stared into the darkness, heart pounding. I woke my friends, but the whispering stopped as soon as they opened their eyes. The forest returned to silence. They didn't hear it. They didn't see anything. And as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I knew what I'd heard. The thing, whatever it was, hadn't left us. It was still there, waiting. In the morning, we packed up and made our way back down the mountain, moving as quickly as we could. The woods were still quiet, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. By the time we made it back to the trailhead, I looked behind us one last time. The trees loomed taller, darker, and deep within them, I knew we weren't alone. I had always been fascinated by the old house at the end of the street. It was a place I passed every day on my way home from school, its faded, peeling paint and overgrown yard standing out from the otherwise ordinary suburban neighborhood. No one lived there, or at least no one who was ever seen. The house seemed to exist in a quiet, unsettling limbo, untouched by time. One day, I found myself walking past it again, the sun sinking low behind the horizon. Curiosity got the better of me, and before I knew it, I found myself at the front gate. The rusted hinges creaked as I pushed it open, the weight of years shifting as the gate groaned in protest. I stepped into the yard, the grass crunching beneath my feet. The house loomed in front of me, its windows dark and lifeless. I had always heard stories about that house, whispers of strange sounds, of lights that flickered in the night, of shadows that moved in the windows when no one was supposed to be there. But I never believed in such things, at least not until that day. I approached the front door, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. I placed my hand on the doorknob, but it didn't turn. The door was locked. I sighed, feeling a twinge of disappointment, and stepped back. But then I noticed something. Movement from one of the upstairs windows. A shadow, shifting, just for a moment. It wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too human. My heart began to race. I told myself it was probably just a trick of the light, something my mind conjured up in the dim twilight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. Despite my better judgment, I approached the side of the house, creeping closer to a window that was partially cracked open. The boards covering it were old and warped, barely hanging on. I pressed my face to the opening, peering inside. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the outlines of furniture, ancient, covered in dust. A faint glimmer of something metallic caught my eye, resting on a table. Suddenly, a low creak echoed from somewhere inside the house, and I jumped back, heart pounding. My breath quickened as I stepped away from the window, the realization hitting me that I wasn't alone. The silence seemed to stretch, heavy and oppressive, pressing down on me. I had to get out, but just as I turned to leave, I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, as if it was coming from inside the house. "Stay." I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper wasn't a voice I recognized. It wasn't human. It was hollow, almost robotic, like something long forgotten had spoken from beyond the grave. A shiver ran down my spine. My feet felt frozen to the ground. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted in place. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Stay." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to take a step back. I wanted to scream, but my voice felt caught in my throat. My mind was screaming at me to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I could feel the air grow heavier, darker, as though the house itself had become alive, watching me, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as the whispers had started, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I waited, my heart racing, my breaths shallow, trying to convince myself it was over. I turned, finally running, sprinting down the street, my mind replaying the voice in my head. I never went back to that house. To this day, I still wonder what was in there, what was waiting. But some things are better left untouched, hidden away, behind doors that should never be opened. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when my friends and I decided to take a trip out to an old lake, tucked away from civilization. We were looking for something remote, peaceful, a way to escape the noise of daily life. The drive was long, and as we got further from the city, the landscape changed from paved roads to dusty trails and towering trees. The lake itself was beautiful, serene, surrounded by dense forest. We'd read about it online, something about its still, clear waters and the promise of tranquility. The plan was simple: hike around the lake, find a nice spot to set up camp, and spend the day swimming, fishing, and lounging by the shore. When we arrived, we were the only ones there. It felt like we had the entire lake to ourselves, the kind of solitude you only find when you're far away from everything. We unpacked our gear and set up camp, the sound of birds and the rustling of leaves the only things breaking the silence. As the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, we went to the shore to relax. The lake was calm, the water reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. We joked and laughed, tossing pebbles into the water, the sound echoing in the stillness of the woods. It was the kind of peace we'd all been craving. But that peace didn't last. It started with a noise, a distant, hollow thump. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was an animal or just the wind carrying strange sounds from deeper in the forest. But as the evening wore on, the thumping became more distinct, more deliberate. It wasn't fading away either. It seemed to be getting closer. I glanced at my friends, their faces mirroring my unease. None of us said anything at first, not wanting to ruin the atmosphere. But the thumps persisted, and now I could hear something else. Soft whispers, barely audible, carried on the breeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. One of my friends, Sam, broke the silence. "Did you guys hear that?" We all nodded, uneasy. The sound was closer now. Too close. It wasn't just in the distance anymore. It was almost as if whatever was making those sounds was right there, just out of sight. We tried to convince ourselves it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. But whatever it wasn't leaving. The thumping was steady, relentless, and the whispers felt like they were growing louder. "Let's go check it out," Sam suggested, his voice trembling slightly. None of us were particularly eager, but curiosity outweighed our fear. We gathered our flashlights and followed the sound deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler, and the silence seemed to press in on us. The whispers were unmistakable now, low and guttural, spoken in a language I couldn't recognize. It was almost like they were speaking directly into my head, as if they knew I could hear them. Suddenly, the thumping stopped. The forest became eerily still again, and for a moment I thought we'd lost whatever had been making the noise. But then, just as I was about to speak, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Not ours. These steps were slow, deliberate, and there were far too many of them. We stopped in our tracks, shining our flashlights into the trees, but there was nothing. No one there. Yet the footsteps continued, growing louder, as though they were circling us, closing in. Then, out of the corner of my flashlight beam, I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving through the trees. They weren't human, not exactly. More like distorted shapes, figures with no faces, no features, just black voids where they should have been. They didn't run. They glided through the forest with an unnatural, fluid grace. We couldn't speak. We couldn't move. The shadows drew closer, closing the space between us. I could feel their presence, their gaze upon us, even though there was nothing to see. It was as if they were pulling us in, whispering promises of silence and darkness. The forest seemed to breathe, the trees swaying gently as if they too were part of whatever was watching us. I felt as though I was being drawn towards something beyond comprehension. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the shadows vanished, leaving only silence. We stood there, frozen in place, the echoes of their whispers still ringing in my ears. It wasn't until we realized that the lake, once visible through the trees, was no longer in sight. We had wandered too far into the woods, far from where we had set up camp. Panic set in as we realized we were lost, but deep down, I knew whatever had followed us would never leave, at least not entirely. I had always loved nature, the quiet peace of being out in the open, surrounded by trees and distant mountains. One summer, my friends and I decided to spend the weekend hiking deep into a remote part of the forest. No cell service, no electricity, just us, the trail, and the wilderness. It sounded perfect, a chance to disconnect and escape the noise of the world. The hike started easy enough. The trail was narrow, winding through tall trees with sunlight filtering through the canopy. We made good time, laughing and sharing stories, taking occasional breaks to catch our breath. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. It wasn't the usual comforting silence of the forest. It was an unnatural stillness, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. The sky was clear, the stars visible above us. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant chirp of crickets. We built a fire, cooked some food, and enjoyed the peace. But something felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, I heard it. A faint whisper, too quiet to make out, but it sent a shiver down my spine. I stayed still, pretending to be asleep, listening. It wasn't coming from any of my friends. The voices were too distant, too faint, but they seemed to be everywhere at once. I didn't say anything, hoping it was just my imagination. But when I woke the next morning, things had changed. The air felt heavier, colder. My friends noticed it too. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something we couldn't quite explain. While my friends were packing up, I wandered off to explore. The woods had always been my escape, but today something felt different. I followed a narrow path deeper into the trees, drawn by a sense of curiosity and unease. The trees loomed over me, their branches twisted and gnarled, almost like they were watching. That's when I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still among the trees. It wasn't moving, just watching me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. It was hard to make out at first, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. It was a tall, gaunt figure, its face partially obscured by the shadows of the forest. "Hello," I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. The figure didn't move, didn't flinch. It just stood there, as if waiting. Panic set in. I turned to run, but my legs felt frozen, heavy. I couldn't look away. The figure remained unmoving, its presence so unnatural it made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I spun around, expecting one of my friends, but there was no one. The woods were silent again. I didn't wait to find out what was following me. I ran back to camp, heart racing. My friends were there, gathering our things. I didn't want to scare them, so I kept what I had seen to myself. We left the clearing and continued down the trail, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. That night, as we made our way back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see something, anything in the shadows of the trees. But there was nothing. The forest had returned to its usual stillness. To this day, I don't know what I saw. A trick of the light, my mind playing tricks, or something else entirely. But the figure, the feeling of being watched, those are memories that will stay with me forever.